Sorry about the technology issue. This is what the typical type now.
UHF is connected.
Getting this started. I think that'll disappear in a minute. So I've been down, I said down here because I come from Central Jersey, to help Mary out with these classes for a number of years now, and I was finding a really engaging group. So I'm looking forward to this. I understand this is just one of many classes you go through in this program. So there may be some duplication, there may not be, but I'm going to concentrate today on organic gardening for basically for food production. But any of this you can take to annual flowers and whatnot. But I'm not a perennial landscape person or perennial flower person, so that's just not going to be covered today. So I understand that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that it's here for your own personal gain, but also will be helping out Mary and providing advice to other gardeners. Is that correct? Okay, so hopefully you'll come away today with some resources that can make that happen. And I've got I think everybody got a handout. So, and on the back of that, resources, and I'll try to go through those page by page as they come up at the top. And some of this will be really basic.
And next, as I mentioned, going to be speaking to you guys for national security chief about weather news.
Something that's hopefully new to you. It's a part of a full day course that I have done here before, and I'll probably do it again, but I switch around from different parts of the state every year. So there are more advanced aspects of some of my teachings are probably not going to be covered today, but certainly we can cover those by questions and answers. And I'm not going to leave right at 12 o'clock. So you're ask questions. Yes, sir. Okay.
He needs to put the microphone center. He's got it on one side, so every time he turns.
Is that any better?
Here.
No. Is this on there? Is that any better? Okay. Remind me, if you can't hear me, just raise your hand every once in a while. And, yeah. Okay. And I'll try to remember, because I might let my voice die down a little bit. Let's see. Is that going to disappear? Okay. Might have to do it on Mary's screen.
No, it's not on my screen.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So again, I'm gonna try to start out with some of the real basics, and that is first of all, let's think about a site for your garden. So working a minute ago, just have to use it for. I have trouble advancing. I don't know. I think so. Okay. Oh, there we go. Did you hear that?
There was a phone on the screen there waiting.
Okay. Okay, thanks. And you can still hear me? Okay, great. All right. So first of all, some of this is fairly obvious. You need a place with good sun, but you also need a place with access to water. Now, some of you may be gardeners at a community garden, so you may have to bring your water. That's an issue, and it's not an overcomable. But sometimes the facilities don't have good access to water. So if you can site your place, your garden where you've got good access to water, you're way ahead of the game. You can always water by hand if you have to. And there are plenty of ways to get irrigation. This happens to be a soaker hose. They're available in any garden supply store. Basically, it weeps. So it's a real slow release of water. And yeah, you have to leave it on for quite a while. Again, it may not be available at community gardens, but it should be available at any garden supply store. And there are different types. This is also a soaker hose. I think this one is probably only available online. It's not made with recycled tires like the other ones are, but I don't know there's any issue with the other one made with recycled tires, but this is more like a regular garden hose, same type of situation. And those will have the connections that will hook up to your regular garden hose. So usually when you get a soaker hose or any other type of drip irrigation, there will be that type of connection. This is what I call drip tape. Sorry, some of you folks at home can't see this, but basically it's a plastic tape, just like we see here on the film. And there are different types of connections. You usually buy this as a kit. They're pretty easy to put together. You just screw them one way or another, and they hold fairly well. There are ways to tie off the end of this, because you can see that's an open hole at the end of a drip tape. It's a plastic drip tape, and there are I don't know the knots, but I just go to the internet and there's Google knots for drip tape, and they're really good ways to tie that off at the end. So many of us are not going to go to that extent, and there's the old watering can. I would urge you to spend a lot for a really good watering can, because some of the cheap ones, they come out too fast. They break fairly easily. This one is the water actually comes up a bit, so it doesn't go right down onto the plant where you might wash away some of your soil. It's more like a sprinkling rain. And those are available in some garden supply stores, and they're also available online. One of the resources that's in your handout is called Gardener Supply, and that's where I got mine years ago. Probably had it for 15 years. It's still in perfectly good shape. One thing about when you're watering, I call that a sheen. So when you see a sheen on the surface, it means it's saturated. It's not, the water's not going down into the soil. You need to back off for a minute and go to another place, walk down the line, whatever, and let that sink in. Because if I put more water on here when I see a sheen, it's just going to run off. Could cause some erosion depending upon your situation, but it's not going to do any good to put more water on top of here. So think of that as sheens. And also, when you have a feel for your own garden, you can basically judge how much water it needs after a while by how many sheens it takes. So in other words, I see a sheen here. I know that in the springtime, the soil is fairly moist. So in most places, my own personal garden, I can put about 3 sheens on. And generally that's enough water to carry me for a few days, maybe maybe a week if we have a rain in there. But in the summertime, when your soil is a lot drier further down, sometimes I have to go like 5, 6, 7 sheens. But you just have to, do a few sheens, dig a little bit, see what your soil's like, and then you'll get to judge for yourself after a while. So again, if you come away from this talk with just one concept, remember the idea of sheens. So a few basic tools that basically everything I do in gardening is falling down, is done with these simple tools. Sorry, those of you at home, you don't know that my tools on the back of the desk are falling down as I'm talking about. So basically, I've got a digging fork, a spade, it could be a spade or shovel. I could probably do with one of those. A rake, as you see, that rake's a little bent. It's 40 years old, probably even longer than that, because I bought it used. A shuffle hoe, which I'll talk about later, and a regular hoe. That's pretty much my tool kit, I guess. A few others here and there. Okay, so let's start out with are we going to start? There's several ways. If you have a rototiller, I don't advocate using a rototiller very much once you've got an established garden, but just get it started, especially if you're dealing with sod. Not a bad idea. You're better off doing rototilling the fall before. But you know, if you have to do it in the spring, that's fine too. There are other ways that are a little less, I guess, I don't know, destructive of the soil, I should say, and that is, you know, just putting a piece of plastic over it. This can take several months to kill everything underneath here. I mean, sometimes I've seen, you know, huge sheets of plastic. This happens to be one that I got from a dairy farmer. A lot of dairies will use what's called silage bags, which are white on one side and black on the other. So we create some heat. And basically it's killing by taking away the sun. So it's not a quick kill. It's quicker in the summertime or warms up a little bit. Other ways are just to mulch it over the winter time. This happens to be a method, I think it's called the lasagna method, or at least partially a lasagna method, where it's mulched with the layers of cardboard with some kind of compost or straw or mulch in between, could be leaves, and just left on over the winter time. And you know, by the spring, particularly late spring, it's everything underneath is pretty well dead, and you've got a lot of, you know, rich soil additions on the top from the mulches. The other way is plastic, white plastic. Now, I don't actually use this, but I do have, you know, have farmer friends that do. This happens to be a farm situation. In the summertime, it'll kill the grass within about a day or two. If you leave it on much longer than that, you're going to sterilize your soil. You're going to kill a lot of the microbes. So you got to be careful if you do this. Not to leave it on too long, but if you need something done in a hurry, particularly in the summertime, it can work. And a lot of farmers now using this as a way to kill their cover crops without having to do any tillage. So basically, they can put this on for a day, and then they can plant right into that dead cover crop. I'm not a big advocate of raised beds. I'm sorry, I am an advocate of raised beds, but the raised bed definition seems to have gotten co-opted by wooden sides. There's nothing wrong with this, but it's a lot of resources to go into there, and in most cases, you know, it takes a lot of resources to build, cost, and I just don't think it's really needed unless you're in a situation like this where you're building up on this happens to be the city of Trenton, and I think this site was, you know, had something wrong with it, so they couldn't actually use the soil, and they had to build upwards. Personally, I prefer starting out a garden to basically kill the whole area either by rototilling, harrowing, or some kind of mulch, and then take the soil, decide where my pathways are going to be, and leave about 6 feet between beds. So you've got about a 2-foot pathway and about a 3 or 4 foot bed, and throw the soil from the pathways up onto the beds. So you've got a bit of a raise, and those become permanent beds. I don't have to walk on the beds at all, and my pathways become permanent. That's where all my walking is going to be. So I'm not compacting the soil at all. To me, it's much easier than you know, getting a lot of lumber to build the bed. No, and there are certain circumstances that, again, those are going to be appropriate, but I just don't think it's needed in most cases. Yeah, Spin. I'm sorry, okay, so the question was, does a black plastic kill the microbes? And not really. I think maybe if you left it on for too long in the middle of the summertime, it might, but the heat underneath the black plastic is not nearly what it is under it's that greenhouse. You know, we all talk about the greenhouse effect now. Well, that's an agricultural term. It's that clear plastic where the sun gets through it and it heats up and it can't escape. I mean, some of it escapes, but not all of it escapes. It just builds up a lot higher temperature than the black plastic. Yes, okay, yeah, so the question was that the clear kills by the heat, the black plastic just kills by eliminating sunlight. Yeah, so it takes a lot longer because the plants can bounce back. So in my beds, before I plant, I like to go through and loosen it up. Now, there's several ways to do this. I have a very high quality digging fork, which for 30 years was perfect shape. It got a little bit bent from trying to pull out a, grapevine root. They're stronger than my fork. But you don't need real, I've never used a rototiller here in my own garden. And my belief when teaching this course is I don't want to teach a course that forces you to go out and, rent a rototiller, buy a rototiller. Everything I do is with hand. And what I'm doing here is just loosening the soil. So basically, instead of that turning up like that, which can destroy a lot of your what's called soil structure, I'm just basically going down about 6-7 inches, wiggling around a little bit. It takes me about 10 minutes. My beds are about 3.5, 4 feet wide by about 30 foot long. It takes me about 10 minutes to do the whole bed. So basically, I do it in like 3 or 4 rows. There are better tools for doing this. This is called a broad fork. It's available from Johnny's Selected Seeds, some of the catalogs that are in your resources. I don't know if I've seen it being sold locally. It's kind of something that they developed, I believe. But a lot of farms are using this now, rather than rototilling. And basically, it's kind of doing a little bit faster and a little bit easier what I do with my fork. And they have wider ones too. So once I've got that bed established, basically the last step is just to rake it flat with a rake, and I'm pretty much ready to plant. Now I'll get into fertilization and things like that, and cover crops as we're going. So does anybody have any more questions, or you want to make comments? We all learn from each other, so if you have a comment, that's fine too. But I'm going to go on to specific crops right now. Hey, Mary, do the people at home have a way to ask questions?
They can do it through chat.
Okay.
Go ahead, Mayor.
Yeah, sure.
This might sound so good. What's a sheen?
What's that?
What's a sheen?
A sheen, okay. So you ever been on a highway where, it's the middle of the day and you look up, it looks like there's water in the road up ahead? I think that's called a sheen also. So basically it's when the soil surface is reflective. So basically the water is not dropping in, it's basically puddling up. And so that's when you say, okay, it's got enough. Give you a few minutes that'll sink in, but you need to give it a few minutes to sink in.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. All right, so I'm going to go through crops and just basically spring plantings. I've got a whole nother session on fall plants. We're not going to cover that today because it's not fall yet. But I'll go through them one at a time, and I'm not going to include every crop. I don't plant sweet corn. I nothing against sweet corn, but it takes up a lot of space, and it's a whole other story in itself. So there's a few you say, well, I didn't include them all. So the first one is spinach, which actually the reason I'm getting it can be planted early in the spring, but it also going to be planted in the fall for a spring crop. Now around us, which is Central Jersey, I like to plant this around September 15th. And it grows a little bit in the fall, but not very much, and it'll start taking off. So this I believe was taken the first week in May of a spring planted crop. Now, spinach can take a lot of frost, but it's susceptible to what I call frost heaves. I'll show some examples of frost heaves later on, but frost heaves, if you ever look at bare ground in the and probably in March it's most common. The ground is cracked, and it's cracked because there's moisture in the soil, and at night when it gets really cold, frozen water expands, and then warms up in the day and it contracts. So you get these cracks in the soil, and those cracks can lift they can break the roots of the spinach plant. So you just have to make sure you mulch it. Just a little bit of mulch will work fine. But if you forget that, you could be in trouble. Okay. Second thing is fall planted is garlic. You can't really get a good crop of garlic if you plant it this time of year. You really need to plant it in late October. Usually the last week, maybe last 2 weeks in October is fine. You'd like to get some root growth in the fall, but not top growth. And usually the top growth will come on. I think last year was last year it was cold in November. So we didn't really get much, but some years I get a lot of top growth, which I don't really like because it usually some of the top growth dies down in the wintertime and has to regrow. But again, just planting the little cloves, you probably could plant things to get in the store, but you don't really know what kind of garlic it is. This particular type of garlic that I'm holding in my hands here for folks at home has a hard top, so it's called a hardneck. And it's a little different growing. With a hardneck, you get these scapes, which are the first, basically one of the first harvests of the, first garlic harvest of the spring. Come out in about June, I guess. And they have the garlic flavor. You can cut them off and use them just as you would garlic. But then usually the harvest of garlic is probably mid to late July. So that opens something up for, some space up for something to follow through for a fall crop. Okay, so now we're getting into the springtime, and the first thing I put in is scallions. But why scallions? Well, I have a size garden that I like to be self-reliant, self-sufficient. And onions usually don't come in until late July, early August. Now, these are just scallions that I purchased in a store. I have used the tops. My wife and I do a lot of cooking. Use the tops, and I use about 1 inch on the bottom of the scallion. And they can be planted right in the soil. You don't have to bury them very far, but make sure the roots are buried. And this next photo is what they look like in early June. So those are harvestable. And they provide we just use them as we would onions in any recipe. They're a little milder than onions, but doesn't really make much difference to us. And the nice thing about this is if I don't need to harvest them, they'll get to be like leek size by the fall. And again, I can use them, in any recipe that I would use an onion. I don't think they really substitute for leeks, although we don't personally use leeks in cooking. I think leeks have a distinct flavor. But if I do harvest them, I can pull the whole plant out, or I can cut it right at about 1/2 inch above ground level, and it'll grow another scallion. Basically, I can get 2 crops out of this in one year. If I cut those ones in the fall, it's going to be this size as opposed to being that leek size, but I still get green onions pretty much all growing season. Okay, so how many people have planted peas so far? Okay, I have not. I'm trying to find a window. One of the things I've found about peas is a lot of times I plant them and I don't get good germination. I think some of them rot because it's too wet, too cold and wet. How are yours doing?
Haven't come up yet. I planted those.
March 12th, they haven't, yes, that's what I find sometimes. Sometimes when I find they haven't come up, I'm sorry, for those of you at home, a gentleman said he planted on March 12th and haven't really come up yet. Sometimes I find when they sit in the ground too long, they rot, or I don't know, maybe squirrels find them or something like that.
I planted 2 varieties.
I see a window coming next week where there's going to be 3 days of sunshine, and I'm hoping the soil dries out a bit. But I usually have mine planted by now too, but I don't this year. I just haven't found that window. But one thing I found that helps that sitting in the ground too long and rotting is to pre-soak them. So basically, I just put them in a paper towel. If I have it together, I will mix some what's called inoculant, which is something you can get from a garden supply store or a seed catalog. And it doesn't really help the pea crop so much as it helps it fix nitrogen for the next crop coming through. So it forms some kind of a symbiotic relationship with the roots, rhizobacteria, I think it's called. And that will, again, it'll help the crop. It's not necessary, but it just does help my overall production. So basically, I wrap those, I soak those paper towels with peas, and I soak them for about a day and a half. 2 days is stretching it. They can start to go bad or become too brittle to handle if they soak for too long. I wouldn't go any more than 2 days, but I think the ideal is about a day and a half. And I just, again, I'm looking at next week, trying to stay ahead of the weather, and I feel that the danger from peas is not getting enough water. It's getting too much. So if we get a little bit of a dry spell next week after I plant it, I can hand water. But I'm more worried about it just getting soaked. So I don't get a stand like this every year, but that was a pretty good stand, and those peas were soaked ahead of time. Peas are to me, one of the more iffy things. Most times you get a good stand, but sometimes you get rot in the ground, or you just don't get a full germination. So peas like to climb. I like to use these wooden stakes, get them from garden supply stores, and garden supply store. This happens to be one that I like to get a 7-footer. That's maybe only 6.5, but because I like to use it for my tomatoes too, and I like my tomatoes to grow more than 4 or 5 feet. The varieties I use are usually 6-7 foot varieties, and so you need a way to bang them into the ground. And I don't know, these things are not that expensive, maybe a couple dollars, but I find that if I have a little old shampoo bottle or something like that, put it over the top when I bang it in, it really saves the top of the stake, and it makes it last for years rather than just get 1 or 2 seasons out of it. Anybody want to share what you've used for pea stakes? I'm sure there's all options. I've seen old ski poles and things like that. Okay. There's metal poles too. You can get it at supply stores. But okay, so this is basically the pea crop. Once those stakes are in, I just string, tie twine from one. They'll find their way up. You don't really have to do much hand training. So I'm going through the season and getting now into more mid-April, and onions come next. You can get, most places around here, you can get onion sets, and they work fine. I find I've got a lot better result with these onion plants. They're not necessarily available at most supply stores, garden supply stores. I have to order these. And I actually have found, I get mine from Johnny Seeds, one of the catalogs listed in your resources. And they're kind of expensive if you just get one. So I usually get a whole bunch of neighbors together. And so we can order 2 or 3, and the cost goes down to about half the price for getting 3 as it does for 1. But I just find they take off faster, and I get bigger bulbs. Now, I'm not talking right now, the first crop that actually could be planted inside, and I'm not going to get into indoor planting. There are organic potting mixes available. I know the whole food, maybe the closest one is Martin, I'm not sure. They have a line that they sell, probably most garden supply stores do. One around us has a brand, I think it's called Arcadian or something. And you can get grow lights locally. You can get grow lights through a lot of the seed catalogs or the supply stores. But again, that's kind of a whole nother topic that we're not going to fit that in today. So these could be planted inside, but onions they almost take a couple months, even if you have a good grow light. So I just don't bother. I just buy my plants. Okay, so we're moving into, again, mid-April, mid to late April. Probably could even be a little bit earlier, but that's chancy because some of these other crops can be affected by sitting in the ground too long in cold, wet weather. So I'm going to talk about lettuce right now. we, I mean, my family likes to have salads pretty much from, from May until, well, actually, we're still eating our lettuce into January. And I plant lettuce about every 2 or 3 weeks, depending upon the time of year. So, and it is until late August. So I think this is probably, this is 3 plantings of lettuce here. They're all about 2.5 weeks apart. So lettuce comes in, generally it's a small seed. And most small seeded plants, I just make a furrow. A lot of these seeds do not like to be planted very deep. They just don't have the strength to push up. So I make that furrow, and I basically just sprinkle seeds in. And if you see in the diagram, some of them will fall in the bottom of the hole, and some of them will fall on the sides. And I don't actually push soil in there. I just kind of pat the whole thing, and some of them buried it. And I put more seeds in than I actually think I need. So that, it might be that the ones that have gotten a little bit buried are going to germinate if it's a little dry. The ones that are on the sides that don't get buried, they may germinate better if we have kind of a wet spell. But I've basically found that that's a pretty good way. And again, don't push that soil in, just kind of pat it. And I actually kind of karate chop that furrow. Would be perpendicular to the furrow. I karate chop it. That's basically, I found it's a pretty effective way to plant. Now, this is basically looking at the furrow from the top. Now, those are both been planted in lettuce. Now, the difference is that the top furrow, you can't see the seed because it was just regular seed. The bottom furrow is what I call pelleted seeds. And some of these really small crops, I like to get pelleted seed because it's much easier to handle. You actually use less seed because you can actually put them, an inch apart or 2 inches apart. It's very easy to do. And they develop pelleted seeds for farmers who, have automatic planting machines, and it's much easier for them to have a little bit of a round ball. Now, what actually is it? It's basically a clay cover. So this is 2 examples of lettuce seed, but obviously the one on the left is just regular seed, and the one on the right, inside each one of those pellets is a lettuce seed. Carrots come this way also. There's probably other things, but those are the 2 things mainly I use. So I've pretty much gone to a lot of varieties that I can find pelleted. I purchased a pelleted. So you might ask me, like, what varieties do I like to plant? I find that the head varieties are a little bit harder to grow, and I don't grow any. I grow all loose leaves, and there's lots of different types. So I have one's called Tropicana. It's actually a green lettuce, and then there's others that are red. I get Red Fire. I think it's called Red Fire. I used to plant a lot of red salad bowl, which has a really frilly leaf. But I think a lot of farmers have gotten into growing what I call microgreens now. For they harvest it just when those first leaves come up. And I think I found that that's such a popular variety with restaurants that they haven't bred it for getting big in it. And I really found the quality of that. So those are 2 varieties. Anybody else have any particular varieties of lettuce you like to use? I have some bibs, just started to do a Boston bib. Romaines, I'll plant a little bit of that in the summertime, but I don't find it as consistently productive, I guess, as some of the more leafy things. All right. Any comments on the chat? Yes.
So what do you, if you plant lettuce all season long, what do you do in the summertime? If I try to plant lettuce in the summertime, it always gets killed by sunlight.
Yeah, let me see. I will get into that in a minute, or I just want to use cover crops. But this is called Rime, or floating row cover, and there's a lot of different uses for it. But when I plant, I'm sorry, those folks who at home, but it's basically a white. I think it's probably polyester, so it lasts but a few seasons. and it allows about 80% of the sunlight to go through, but it does create that 20% shade. So when I plant heat susceptible crops in the summertime, I cover them with this remake, and it holds enough moisture, additional moisture in, that I get better germination. Now, there are some other varieties, particularly if you want to write these down, I think they call them Batavian, I think they call them Batavian varieties, that I found do a little bit better in the summertime, and one of them is magenta, and the other is Nevada, and I've seen those sold at various garden supply stores. And the problem with this fulling row cover is you can only get it minimum 50 foot lengths, and you probably don't need 50 foot. If I were to get a 50-foot length, it'd probably last me for a dozen years, because they do wear out after a while, get holes in them. But the last in-person workshop I did with a salesperson or a representative of Johnny Selected Seed, and I told him I wanted to talk about this, so he gave me this. He gave me this roll. So if anybody wants to cut a piece off today and take home with them, I've got a tape measure and I've got some scissors, and you're welcome to do that. Yes.
So you use that as a canopy above the?
I just put it right on the ground. Now, it can be used as a canopy for other reasons, for pest controls, and I'll try to talk about those later. But you'll see a photo of this on the. So those of you at home will see a photo of this later. I think it's when we're talking about cover crops, because I do use it for helping to germinate cover crops too. So, okay, the next thing I like to put in is carrots. And plant about the same time as lettuce, mid to late April, but those can be planted later also. Same type of seed. They also come pelleted, so there's not much difference there. They do like loose ground, so if you have a way to loosen your ground, whether it be rototiller or a fork like I have, or just a digging fork, that's fine. And by the way, these digging forks, I think it's American Tool Company, which is located in Bridgeton. It's just a small cottage industry company. They make very good tools, and they do make a pretty good digging fork too. I like to put a little plug in sometimes for local businesses. And then also about the same time is beets. Now talk a little bit more about beets when we get to talk about disease, because I do have a problem with them. Beets are one thing I actually have tried to grow in pots from scratch in the spring, and you can plant bunches of beets. So I planted these, and you see some of them have 4 or 5 beets growing in them. I thin them down to 3, maybe 4, and I'll just plant that pot I'll plant that about every foot. So normally when I seed beets, I plant them about every 4 inches. But when you plant them this way, you've got a clump here, a clump there, and if I go back, that produces some really nice beets. These beets were planted this way, and these were harvested in July. Really, really healthy crop. Matter of fact, I just thinned them. These were the biggest ones, and I let the other ones go, and I harvested them later on. Normally, I don't have enough sunlight to grow crops that are longer time period, just in a windowsill. But beets are planted late enough also that this is on my front steps. I keep them on the front steps unless it gets really cold out. But they did grow a lot slower than I heard that they grow in a greenhouse. But it is possible to do that, and you can do it for a later crop also. Chard, same family. Can plant about the same time, but you can pretty much plant chard up until July, and it'll still get a good crop in the fall. So it can be a second crop as you take garlic out. Okay, so we're kind of into late April, could be even early May, and potatoes is one of the next things that can go in. And you can you can buy seed potatoes. You can get them from mail catalogs. You can get them from probably most garden supply stores. I've also used things that I've either grown before or purchased. You're taking a little bit of a risk there, because the ones that you purchase as seed potatoes, they're tested to be disease-free. You're taking a risk if you buy one in a store, but they'll still grow. And a lot of times they're the size that you can plant the whole spud. So there's no preparation, but you can also cut bigger ones in half and plant those too. Now, if I cut these in half, and you can see that it was just cut, there's still moisture there. These would rot in the soil. You've got to let this sit for about 3-4 days, maybe more, until this surface hardens over. So basically, it's got to kind of form a new skin. It won't form a regular skin like is on the rest of the potato, but it's got to harden up. Otherwise, this will just start to rot from that point on. You won't get anything. So potatoes, I like to dig a trench for several reasons. I'll plant those potatoes in the trench, and then I will start to use the mounded soil on the side to cover them. Basically, that's my way of keeping the weeds down. And they like to have those roots buried. They'll tend to produce spuds on the top of the soil, which will get sun scald. So if you have that extra soil that you can keep pushing into the trench to cover them, then I get a little bit better, better production and less sun scald. And I usually do like to mulch potatoes after that, that last bit of that little the trench in the middle has gone, because again, some of them will still produce potatoes on the surface of the soil, which will succumb to sun scald. You can usually cut out the sun scald places, but they turn green, and they're, I guess, I won't get into the health study because I don't really know it, but I know they don't eat green potatoes. Anybody have any questions so far? Yes. I'll get into that. We're going to talk about we'll talk about weeds later on. But that's a good question. Yes.
When you plant your potatoes, are you putting any additives into the hole?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I do put some compost right in the bottom of the hole. Yeah, it's well rotted compost too. Okay. So the question was, do I do anything for the into the hole, or for fertility? I guess basically. Yeah, and yes, I do put some. Not a lot, but just sprinkle an inch or so in the bottom of the hole, and I don't need a lot because I have pretty good soil. I do that every year. Okay, tomatoes, a big one.
I'm sorry, before you continue,
And this is the same family as potatoes. So I often usually plant them in the same row, same bed. And another thing that's in that family, I'm sorry, yeah. This is something that takes about 6 weeks to grow from the seedling inside, and I don't have that capability. If you do have a good spot, that's fine. I welcome you. You can pick your own varieties. But I find that either garden supply stores or particularly farmers markets, if you want to get organically raised ones, they're easy to find there. I have the same farmer I get my seedlings from every year. They grow lots of extra to sell at their farmers market stands in mid-May. We're probably a little colder than Central Jersey, a little colder than down here, so you probably can get them in, maybe in early May, May 10th, whatever. And you can certainly push that. But I know 2 years ago, we had a really devastating frost on May 9th. So I think probably it covered the whole state. So, frost can come late, and tomatoes don't have a lot of tolerance. But basically, it's put this in here because I go out and buy mine. I like to get ones that are fairly decent size, and I like these. I think they call them peat pots, or maybe it's even manure pots. I'm not sure what they're made of, but because I don't have to remove it from a pot. You can't hear me. Thanks. Is it going back and forth?
When you turn your head to the screen.
Oh, okay.
You're away from the
All right, I get the habit of looking at this. Yeah, and I find this thing keeps twisting around too. So this peat pot, I can basically just crumble it up a little bit when I plant. And if you notice, I'm picking off some of the lower leaves. The little hairs on the tomato stem all have the ability to form a root. Of course, most of them won't. But if I can bury it up to what I'm seeing is the bottom leaves that are left on there, I'm allowing a lot more of that plant to be in the ground. That shock for transplanting into the ground, it just helps it come through that a lot faster if I allow that plant to produce more roots. So basically, I'm picking off, in this case, it's a good sized tomato, so I picked up probably the bottom 2 sets of leaves, and I'm gonna try to bury it to that first leaf right there. That seems to make it take off a little fast. Kind of an answer to your question about fertility. With transplants, particularly tomatoes, I do use a little bit of, this happens to be fish emulsion, this liquid seaweed, fish emulsion, a lot of organic products. Again, there's resources available in your handout. I think I get this one from not Gardener Supply. I'll go through the resource list later and go through this, but just put a little bit in a bucket, my watering can, and when I water them in, it gets a little bit of extra nutrition. It makes it jump out a little bit faster. So basically, I use a staking system, the same as my peas. The difference to this is in the peas, you just put in each row of twine, and the peas will find it and attach to it. This one, tomatoes don't have that ability. So with this particular system, and it doesn't have to be with these wooden stakes, it can be with anything. One of my strings will go to the left of the plants, and the next week, or sometimes in early season, they're really growing fast. The next time I put a string in, it'll go to the right of the plants, so that I'm kind of corralling them in so they'll grow straight. Because otherwise, they'll go on the ground. It'll rot a lot faster. I'm not crazy about these things. These tomato cages will kind of do the same thing. The reason I'm not crazy about them is sometimes I find that they don't stay inside the cages, and then if you let a branch get too big, and it's hard to get it back inside. So yeah, but they're fine. Now, the issue always comes up of pruning tomatoes, and there's different philosophies. Some say don't prune at all. Some say prune every little sucker off. Now, what is a sucker? This is a branch where a leaf has come out on the tomato plant, and the crotch of that branch, and between the crotch and the stem, it'll start growing. Actually, it's like a whole new tomato plant. So it will, it'll produce, every one of these leaves, it'll produce another one of those. And if you let them all go, you're producing a heck of a lot of green and not many tomato fruit. At least that's my philosophy. Others will say, well, don't worry about it. It hurts it if you cut it off. I don't necessarily believe this. I compromise. I cut suckers off until I get tired of it. And that's usually when the tomatoes are that big, and I can't find them anyways. And then I just let them go after that. But another philosophy is to leave 2 main stems per tomato plant. And again, this is a little harder to do with those cages. But you'll notice is the one main stem, which is the original one, and then I'm letting another one grow off the side there, which is it's a little bit behind the first one, but it's gonna grow to basically a full plant. And I found that to be a pretty good compromise. However, this one's coming off the bottom of the plant, and I'm finding that it produces leaves that are fairly low down, and those leaves are more susceptible getting soil splashed up on it, or having rains, and causing some kind of disease. So I've kind of evolved from that a little bit into letting my second main shoot come from about a foot up above the ground. And I find that's it gives me a little bit of an advantage for disease control. How's the volume now? Is that okay? My voice? I'm trying to keep that steady. So yeah, so again, this is the, yes. Yeah. Yeah. You can break them off when they get a little bit big. If you break it off, it can tear the main stem. So you might want to have a knife in your pocket. Yeah. Yes.
That spring,
There might have been
when we got spring on the boys. Does that string hurt the plant? Obviously, it doesn't.
Okay, so the question was, does the string hurt the plant? I have not found that. It's a natural substance. I don't know what it is, jute or hemp or something like that. I'm not sure. So it's not real hard, no. It's possible. But it's not, there shouldn't be a lot of pressure on there. You know, if I was trying to, if I didn't keep up with this weekly and I had to kind of pick something up off the ground and hold on to a lot of weight, then it might. But I don't really see much damage.
How do you feel about Epsom salt in the tomato?
Well, Epsom salt, it's magnesium sulfate, I believe. Does that sound right? Magnesium sulfate?
Yes.
Yeah, and both of those are, you know, are nutrients that crops can use, and it's not like regular salt where it's, you know, sodium can have some desiccating effects on the plant. So yeah, it is used as it's a natural fertilizer.
Just for tomato.
What's that?
Just for tomato. Did you use it for anything?
Well, probably for anything, but I think tomatoes like a little bit of sulfur, as do, and they probably like some magnesium. Too much magnesium in the soil can create what's called a tight soil. You know, in the South Jersey sands, that may not be as much of an issue.
Would you put the plant right on top of that?
I've never done it, but I don't think it would hurt it. Yeah, I wouldn't put too much on the bottom. The question is, can you put that? Can you put some magnesium sulfate right in the hole and plant on top of that? I'm not sure about that, but I think you probably could. And I'm sorry, you didn't hear the first. Those at home didn't hear the first question. Was should we use an? Can you pick off suckers, or should you use a knife? And most of them can be picked by hand if you're small. But when they get to be big, if you tear them off, you can damage the main stem. Yes. Sure. This one? Yeah. So the branch will obviously have, well, there's two kinds of branches in there. The one that's in the middle, that's not very large, that's actually a branch that's coming right off the stem, and that's a fruiting branch. I don't know if that's the right word for it, a branch. But you can almost, I think there's actually some flowers that are hanging down there. Those will come right off the main stem. The suckers will first of all, the other branches, they're leaf branches. And that's where the suckers will come from. It comes from those leaf branches. So you won't, and they don't produce the suckers right away. So in other words, you'll see a well-formed leaf branch, and that's where the suckers are going to come from, where that leaf branch hits the main stem. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay. Yeah, try it out, you'll see. Yeah, again, they can get pretty big, so I like my stakes fairly high, probably fairly early in the season, because after a while, some of those bottom leaves will start to disease. Disease always comes up from the bottom by the end of the year. Peppers can be planted at the same time, same way. And again, I have different types of peppers, hot peppers, yeah, I love those. Eggplant, interesting crop because it's one I actually don't plant. The reason I don't plant it is because flea beetles, for some reason, love eggplant. And if it's the only crop in your garden that they like, they'll all go to the eggplant. And I just find they keep decimating the leaves. So I've kind of given up on growing eggplant. But you know, South Jersey is, you know, a prime area for eggplant. It's known for its tomatoes, but it's also known for its eggplant. So you know, maybe it's just a little bit warmer in South Jersey than it is in North Jersey, and you know, it grows well. So give it a try. But you may find those flea beetles, they're hard to control organically. Even if you have an organic spray, they seem to, you know, back in a day or two. And underneath, most of the organic sprays don't really work on flea beetles. So again, I'll talk about it when I talk about pests, but my method for flea beetle control is not to plant what they want to eat. and the time they want to eat it.
Uh,
Yeah, go ahead.
My eggplants, I mean, that's a main part of my garden.
Great.
Yeah, we love it. But I have a hard time with zucchini. Am I watering it too much?
Yeah, I'm kind of the opposite. My zucchini does well. Well, I'll get into cucurbits right now. So yeah, say that question. So
Someone did have a question about,
Okay, go ahead,
should they add calcium to tomatoes?
what was that?
Should they add calcium to their tomato plant?
It never hurts. I don't know if can they hear your voice too? Or do I need to repeat the question?
Probably repeat the question.
Okay, so the question is, can you add calcium to your tomatoes? It never hurts. I assume you're talking about some calcium in the form of limestone or something like that. I don't add any to mine because my pH is high sixes and I've actually been into the sevens. I've been trying for a number of years successfully to get it down back into the sixes. And generally, when your pH is high, it means there's plenty of calcium in the soil. If you're composting, you're adding eggshells, and a lot of other things in the compost are going to provide some calcium. It doesn't hurt to add some in the way of brown limestone or possibly wood ashes, but be careful not adding too much to increase your pH because that can have some negative effects. Okay, so now we're getting into mid to late May, and this is the whole what I call the cucurbit family. Includes your zucchinis, your winter squashes, your melons, pumpkins. So I like to plant those in an area where I've had good weed control in the past, because once these things get to be so big, I can't get into that patch anymore. So I'm able to control, and again, for your question over there, ma'am, I'll talk about weed control in a bit, but I starting out with quite a weed-free area here. It is a family of crops, so everything in that family I put in one bed because that's the way I rotate my crops. It's by family. I direct seed it. You can transplant them, but they don't act as well planted. There's some difficulty in transplanting. So I just wait till the ground forms up. And I actually have waited till June, because sometimes you get really cold, wet weather in May, and the ground really doesn't warm up until later on. So better off when the ground's warm, those seeds will pop right out of the ground. And if you plant it a few weeks earlier, these things will catch up pretty quickly. Maybe not completely, but pretty quickly. And often get to look like that. That's basically winter squash bed. Some of your melons won't be melons or other things. Summer squashes won't be quite as thick as that, but so you can get in there to harvest them. I find that makeshift cages work well with cucumbers. Cucumbers is one of these crops that will climb, just like the peas did. So I make a little cage like that, basically just string it up, and it makes it a lot easier to harvest, and it keeps it more contained, so it doesn't spread all over the garden. Now this is one whole family of crops, aside from maybe some of your summer squash. It kind of will take over a large area of the garden. So I like to plant them in an area that I planted peas, for instance. Those peas are out by the time these things spread, so that they have a little bit of room to spread out. What was your question about zucchini? I think we're talking about.
I get a lot of green, but I don't get a lot of plant. And as you showed the picture of it a while ago, I thought the flower was the plant. The flower is not the plant. The plant comes out of a different area. Should I cut the flowers off? Some people actually gradually leaving that.
Yeah, I've done that too. I'm sorry. So the question is.
And I water them too much because I unfortunately I use a sprinkler.
Yeah, I did too.
And next to my eggplant, and maybe I'm getting too much water.
Okay, so the question, the issue is that the summer squashes are producing a lot of plant and fruit, I mean, in flowers, but not necessarily fruit. I don't know for a fact, but I found that issue the last, particularly the last, I think, 2 years, where we had a really hot July. And I don't know if this is true of all, but I know there's a lot of winter squash varieties that they don't produce female flowers, which is what's going to produce the fruit in really hot weather. So I know that, again, particularly the last few years, I've especially noticed in my winter squashes, I don't get any female fruit until like early August. I don't notice that. I can't think that that's actually carried over into the summer squashes, but it's possible that's one thing. Too much nitrogen, maybe you're over fertilizing is another possibility that it's going to produce more plant and less fruit. Maybe side dressing with a little bit of high potassium, which does produce, and that is actually a good source of that is green sand, although it's slow acting, so you really have to put it on in the fall.
I thought if I switched them with my tomatoes,
I'm sorry, if you switch them.
I don't know big crops very well.
Yeah, switching to the tomato area. You mean where the tomatoes were the previous year?
Yeah.
It's possible. Yeah, I think some of that has to do with the weather, but I
I
can't.
have a buddy of mine, and he was a couple of miles away, and he just seemed like,
Mm.
and I thought, oh, I'm good, maybe I'm more than.
Yeah, I would say more than water, I would worry about over fertilizing or over fertilizing with nitrogen.
Or definitely cut the flowers off?
I don't cut the flowers off. No, but I mean, they're edible. You have many more than you need, many more of the male flowers, although the male flowers don't produce as much. Actually, the female flowers is more edible there, but
But then what do? They don't do anything, they don't have.
well, not until the female flowers come out. Yeah, I mean, I guess that, they provide some kind of pollen for the insects, but yeah, they don't do any fertilization until those female flowers come out. And yeah, it's interesting because it seems like if it's an over nitrogen issue, then you wouldn't get those male flowers either, but I'm not sure about that. Okay, so beans, another thing that is a warm weather crop. So put them in the ground when the soil's nice and warm. They'll pop right out of the ground. They're more hardy than peas, so they won't necessarily rot if you put them in. And they don't germinate right away, or they have to sit in wet weather. But they like the hot ground. I don't plant a lot of beans, so I don't have specific varieties. But there's a lot of them out there. The reason I don't, because I travel a lot. I'm an organic inspector, so I'm on the road a lot, and I'm just not home every day to pick them. So, and you've got things like this in okra, you just have to be there almost every day to pick. Again, okra is something like the warm weather, put on at the same time. So in my own particular scenario, I actually have 7 beds. I try to rest one every year with a cover crop, and I find that the clovers are a good cover crop. I'll talk a little bit more about cover crop establishment. But I plant by families, and sometimes it's not actually a family. It's just like small early things like lettuces and carrots and things like that. But other ones, the cucurbits, that's the melon, squash family. Solanaceous, that's the whole tomato, pepper, potato, eggplant family. Those particularly are ones that you don't want to put in the same place every year. So if you plant them in one block, remember where they are. Try to stay away from that area for the next 3 years because there can be disease that build up in that one particular place. If it's easier for them to splash up on the leaves and affect them next year. So rotate that, and onions and garlic, it's the Lilium family. I plant that as one family. Fall brass. I don't plant brassicas. I didn't talk anything about brassica. Again, this is part of a whole day course that I talk about fall crops, and that's another one of those crops that has a lot of flea beetle problems in the spring, and they're more susceptible to early warm weather. So I plant those after I take my onions out of the ground, and I plant them for a fall crop. And there's no flea beetle issue in the fall. The flea beetles are gone by then. So yeah, that's the way I rotate. I actually get a double crop. So let's see. I think that takes us to the end of session one. Mary, how do you usually take 2 breaks during the morning?
Usually one.
Usually one. Okay, because I've got like in three sections. I've got to change PowerPoint right now.
Okay, that's fine.
A few, maybe 2 short breaks, something like that.
That's fine.
Okay. And, keep the questions coming. I may need. So I hit that X up.
All the ones I come to, I text Donna this morning. I said, hey, are you going to the vegetable class? I'll see you there. She goes, no, I'm not going to that one.
She doesn't, she comes to very few.
I
Yeah.
knew she was coming to every single one. Oh, that's the,
Yeah.
so much.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, okay.
I have. Trees.
With you?
Okay. Oh, yeah, yeah.
Can we go up there? Or should I bring them?
No, you can break them off. It's fine.
It's on Friday.
And the idea is you put things in at the top, and when it fills up, by the time things get to the bottom, they're quite well composted. You can pull them out the back. Now, one of the things I found is that moisture will build up. So you may have to add things like leaves, shredded leaves or something like that, or for extra carbon or moisture absorption. Our county does not allow us to recycle egg cartons, paper egg cartons anymore with the papers. So I just tear my egg cartons up and put them in the compost, and that provides some carbon, it provides some moisture absorption. But I also find that I use that fork that you saw earlier every once in a while to get in. This is not my own, but my niece was having issues with hers, so I kind of found that getting in there every once in a while, maybe once a month with a fork, and just kind of stirring things up, it allows some of that moisture to dissipate because it gets exposed to the air. It doesn't create that clump of moist goo. There are certainly other designs. This one's a bigger one. It's more expensive. Again, I don't know where it commercially was available, but and there's lots of homemade methods too, just using cement block. Turn them on its side. You lose a little bit out those holes, but then it allows the air, moisture to get in. This is it can be built big enough to combine a lot of yard waste, leaves and whatnot with your kitchen scraps. There are a number of turning barrels. This is a big one. It's an expensive one. I've heard that there's moisture problems in here. There's a lot of smaller ones now, and there's some in those catalogs that they're more kitchen size. But again, our next door neighbor has one, and she has to. I have a shredder, so every fall I'll shred up a big bag of leaves for her, and she just adds those in as extra carbon and extra moisture. But even with that, it doesn't. It's not perfect. Those of you that don't have access to a place to compost, you could consider a worm farm, I guess it's called. There's probably do-it-yourself guidelines on the internet somewhere, but there's several varieties of this that are available commercially. It's basically these trays that are, I think there's 3 or 4 of them, and you're shaking your head. Have you used one? Yeah, and you put the new stuff on the top, is it, or the bottom?
Yeah, from the top.
Okay, and then as it goes down, it decomposes, and the worms will find their way from one.
Find their way up, and then you harvest the bottom tray.
Okay, so you harvest the bottom tray, and I think the very bottom tray is usually where the liquid is, and you can use that as a liquid fertilizer. We talked about putting some in a tomato hole when you plant them. But the second and the bottom is where the finished compost will be, which is probably a little bit more like. No, that's the liquid. Okay, and that's probably fairly well finished. And you use a carbon source, you shredded
But doesn't tell me what classes they.
paper.
That's a different one.
Credit
Go
card
to.
bills.
How do I get to that?
Worms eat my credit card bills.
You have to go back
Worms
to
eat my
the
credit card bills, yeah.
online report and
So that's a
keep
great
scrolling down
use of
to
credit
find
card
one
bills,
that says
yeah.
that.
There actually is a
Oh, okay.
book called Worms
See what I'm
Eat
saying?
My Garbage.
That was close.
Yeah,
Yes,
and
you're close.
it's a fairly old book, but as far as I know, it's still published. And you can still get it, particularly online. I eventually, for my own heap, I went to a what I call a 3-stage compost pile, and those newspapers, I only put those down when it was new because I wanted to smother the grass that was there before. But I basically put fresh stuff on the right. It's the larger chamber, and then I will move it from one section is where the middle section is where most of the active composting goes on. And I probably could manage that well enough to get heat, but I don't. I've never gotten really a hot pile there. And then when it's finished, I put it on the left is where I use it from. Now, one thing about the section on the right, particularly during the garden season or the end of the garden season, when you've got a lot of tomato vines or whatever to put in there, it can get pretty full. So there's a couple of things. If you notice, if you look at the the post on the front, on the right-hand side of the screen, the one you can see, there's a little, it's actually a tractor pin that's there with a clip on the end. And I'll show you a little bit. Okay, that's one end and that's the other end. So I can take that out, go back a few. I can take that bottom board out and then I don't have to like lift up the compost to turn it. I can just kind of rake it over or push it over. It just makes it a lot easier. And there's probably variations on that, but I just find that it's a labor saver. And sometimes I have to get in there and cut up. I have a pretty good machete, probably other things you could use too, but I find machete comes in handy for a lot of things. And this is one thing I'll use it for is just to cut up smaller pieces. I don't use a lawnmower inside the garden for anything because I'm afraid of bringing in grass seed and whatnot into the garden. So I don't like shred things up when they're actually in the garden. I bring them to the compost pile. If I have to shred them, I'll do it there. This is a kind of a specialized compost. It's actually leaf mold that I experimenting with it now, but it's the idea is it sits here for a couple of years, and I'm trying to grow fungal mycelium. So I can inoculate my soil with fungal mycelium, which helps with the exchange of nutrients. Basically, my mycelium, some kind of fungus. And there's hundreds, probably thousands of different types of mycelium. But if you disturb the soil, you break the mycelium every time you hoe or whatever. Or even every time I turn the compost pile, I can break up that mycelium, and then it kind of has to start all over again. So this is long term. I let it sit for a couple of years. Now I'm starting to take out of it, and I don't know how well it's doing. I don't know the effect, but again, the concept is to try to use that mycelium as well as the bacteria. Bacteria is one form of nutrient exchange in the soil, and mycelium is another. Both of those are able to extract nutrients from the soil. But and actually, mycelium and the bacteria kind of work in conjunction at the tip of the plant root. So having some of those in the soil will be helpful. Now, I don't like to waste things. So what do you do with bones? I found that if I've tried two things. This one works the best, but I have to use limestone. So I have a bucket, a 5-gallon bucket that I have maybe half full of limestone, and I can bury fairly large bones in there, and you can see that's some kind of a large bone. But if it sits in the limestone for a couple of years, then I don't know the chemical reaction, but it breaks apart. So I can kind of break it, and if I need to put limestone on, I can, it's using up some of my bones, but bones are higher in phosphorus. So that, that's another way of adding phosphorus to the soil. From what I understand of the geology of New Jersey is that most of your soils from the south down, and they don't follow the straight east-west line, they follow the same southwest and northeast that the hills of Pennsylvania forms, are what I call glauconate based soils. They have some kind of, and they're higher in potassium. And potassium, so for us in North Jersey, we have different geology. So we need sources of potassium. You may not need those down here, but we have an overabundance of phosphorus. So I have to be careful not putting too much phosphorus on, but it might come in real handy in South Jersey. Just another thing, you have a lot of seafood industry in South Jersey. So what do I do with these? Well, the year I built my shed, I had some, I could have done this with a cement block, but I had some cement delivered to fill up these posts. And I just built a box that had some extra, actually I had some extra, I sunk some, these, I bolt, yeah. Tied a couple strings on them, and I just pick them up above the shells, and then I get them. Some of this is powder, some of it's still. I may have to do this a few more times. Some of it's fairly still large chunks, but I can put this on the back on the soil. I actually stopped doing this because my pH got too high. I was doing too much of it. And so this is a good aside for the compost, is I stopped doing this, and then the Rutgers agronomist, he's the main agronomist for the state, said, stop putting eggshells in your compost pile. He grows chickens. He's not that far away. So I actually save my my eggshells for him, and he feeds them back to his chickens. But I don't put them in the soil. And over the last 5 years, I have dropped my pH from 7.1 back down to 6.7, which is it's a much better pH to be in. 7.1 is a little high. Again, that getting back to that bag fertilizer, it's available. And I do use it for strawberries. I will use it for other things if I have to when I run out. You can get whole loads of compost. This is mushroom compost. There's organic mushroom compost from mushroom houses. They don't spray it for fly control or anything like that. You can get it by the truckload. Now, it doesn't cost that much. What costs is the transportation. So if you have a pickup truck and you go out to, what county is that in Pennsylvania? Yeah, it's a Kennett Square area. I forget the county name, but all those towns around there, and there's some that are in Berks also. But particularly, I believe there's maybe some sources on that resource list. Now, a truckload, I don't have the type of garden the size garden to use a truckload, but it could be something you share with others. And sometimes a farmer will get some, a local farm, and maybe they have some extra. You might only need a barrel full. I just spread it by hand. Take a shovel full and just kind of wiggle my hand. It sprinkles out. Usually in the row. Again, a good question about the potato trench. I put it in there, but I'll cover the whole soil with it when I'm planting smaller, other crops. If it is a type of crop with a hole, I'll usually put a little bit right in the hole. And the question came up about, can you put Epsom salts or magnesium sulfate in that hole? And I would think you could, but I don't want to tell you yes. Go ahead.
I have access to horse manure with, straw. My friend of mine, I don't use it 1 year, but is it any?
Yeah, the question is, it has access to horse manure. Yeah, it's fine. Two things about horse manure though. If you can compost it for a while, it's best because horses eat grass and they're a little less fussy than like a dairy cow about eating grass that's mature. So there tends to be more weed seed and it's a lighter manure. You tend to get more bedding, I think, with it when you most sources. But because of that, because it's fairly light and there's a lot of other material in it, it does compost fairly well. But I would try to compost a bit to try to maybe either germinate or kill some of those weed seeds. Yeah, you can use it. Yeah, it's probably fresh though. So using it fresh is, it's got to go through a whole breakdown process before the plants are really able to use it. If you do that outside the garden, that's fine. If you do it in the fall, that's better. But you are introducing some potential weed seeds, but that may not be the biggest issue.
People put water in a barrel with that and make some kind of juice and put on the.
Yeah, you can use that like I talked about with the fish emulsion, the worm liquid. And I'm sorry, the question was, can you just put it in a barrel? It's compost tea or manure tea. It's better if that manure or compost is fairly well broken down. Just because, what is it? I think it's nitrates or something like that. I'm not sure what I don't remember what the issues are, but it's more in a form that the plants can use it. Yes, ma'am.
The answer to that in our reading class or week class, they need to be aged.
Age, horse manure or any manure.
Horse manure, because
Yeah.
cow manure, cows have horse stomachs.
Yeah.
So they can break down and all that kind of stuff. Where horses don't.
So
But Mary taught us that.
I don't know if you guys at home could hear that, but Mary, the comment was that Mary taught another class on use of manures, and Okay, okay, yeah, so reinforce that idea of trying to compost or age that horse manure. Because horse only has one stomach, they're not a ruminant. Whereas cows have 4 stomachs and they get a lot more digestion of those wheat seeds. Okay, I'm gonna move off of compost. Does anybody have any comments or questions on compost? Okay. So another really plentiful source of nutrients in our area is leaves. You know, we have our own shade trees. Most municipalities will pick up or people will leave it out on the street. You know, in our neighborhood, people leave it out on the street, and I go around and pick it up. I keep a barrel in my car in the fall, and I just pick up leaves. I've told you I planted in beds, and this doesn't matter if you have a you know, bed with wooden sides or just my bed. You see the green in there, or some kind of a cover crop, or maybe it's weeds, and the brown is where my pathways are. So I like to put all my weeds in the pathways over the winter time for 2 reasons. One is I can walk on it; it's not going to be muddy. Maybe 3 reasons. One is you know, it would be killing any weeds that are coming up over the winter time or early spring, and that stuff's starting to break down, and eventually I'm going to get those nutrients back into the soil, into my crops. By springtime, it still looks pretty much the same way, but if I didn't do anything here and you know, just kept walking on it, those leaves pretty much disappear by midsummer. They just break down, and each time, you know, as they age, they get more brittle. So each time you step on them, they're breaking down into smaller pieces, and then they're starting to decompose, or they're in the process of decomposing. Pretty much, I have fall raspberries, and that's the only nutrient I've ever used on my raspberries. I just cover the bed with, you know, I get some nice healthy crops. This is what a fall raspberry bed looks like. I'm not going to get into the fruit very deeply, but they're a crop that you cut down to the ground every year. So I cut this down to the ground so I can cover the whole bed with nothing but leaves, and then those new sprouts will start pushing up through the leaves again. And at the end of end of these slides, I'll show you a soil test from the strawberry bed. Quite amazing. It's really good soil. So several ways to handle those leaves. You can rake them into bed and chop them in. And I wouldn't do this in something you're going to plant at least very early. I usually do it in the bed that I will be planting cucurbits in. That's the melons, the squashes, because if you think of your compost, often get squashes or melons or sprout out. My theory is that it's not as important. It's not as is it others? A lot of times, I'll chop that in, but other times, I'll get a photo. Other times, I'll just push those leaves back, and I'll scrape that soil, maybe a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch of soil from the bedway, from the pathway, because over the course of the last year, they get a little bit of erosion. They wash the soil down into the bed, and also the bottom of this leaf pile has started to decompose. So there's nutrients in there and soil there that I want to use in my beds. I don't want it to keep in the pathway. So it's kind of a ritual. I'm always scraping that pathway. And sometimes I scrape the leaves up with it too, but usually it's just the soil. You know, other ways to add nutrients to soil with any type of mulch, straw mulch. Straw and hay are different. Straw generally does not have grass seeds in it. It may have a few. Straw is the leftover stock of a grain. Around here, it's usually wheat. You can get barley. Barley and rye are actually earlier grain crops that are harvested earlier. There's less likely to be later seeding weeds like thistle in there. I'm not saying thistle is a big problem with straw, but it's possible. If you're using hay, that's okay. You know, a lot of times the old hay is sold as mulch hay. It's pretty cheap, but you are potentially bringing in weed seeds. I always use straw in my potatoes, just to, I mentioned that before, just to cover the tops of the plants, but also it's adding nutrients as it proposes. Okay, so I'm gonna get into cover crops, and there's your handout, page 5.
Someone did have a question.
Okay, go ahead, Mary.
How do you compost a large amount of things? I can easily fill up compost roller in an entire month.
So the question is, how do you compost a large number of things? Easily fill up compost roller, is that it?
Yeah.
Well, that's one thing I find about the turn. I think you mean the turners that will rotate. They're really meant for kitchen size, and when you start bringing in refuse from the garden, they really you don't really have the space there for it. So I guess in that case, I don't really think I have an exact answer for that question, but I probably would leave some of those old tomato vines and whatnot right in the garden. If you have a way to chop them up, whether it be a lawnmower or a machete or something like that, let them decompose there. It's better to bring them into a compost pile, but if you don't have that capacity, there's not much you can do about it. So on page 5 of your handout, I've got common others, but these are pretty much the ones I'm going to cover. They're the common ones, and I've tried to go by commonality, I guess. Winter rye and wheat, they're oats. I think the first 3, they're all grafted. Winter rye is usually available at garden supply stores, but sometimes garden centers, but sometimes they don't get the seed in until late fall. It's too late to plant. So sometimes you might have to plant the head. Because they're off main storage, they are susceptible to weevils. So I like to store in old coffee cans. Large jars are okay, but they let sunlight in, and sunlight can have some detrimental effects. So you got to keep them in a space where they're not going to get sunlight, which will heat up the interior, but it also, I think it might have some other detrimental effects. Most of the rest of are listed here are some kind of legume. So a legume crop will take atmospheric nitrogen and fix it into the soil. Talked a little bit about that with the inoculant with the peas, but you've got cover crops here that will do the same. So I've tried to give a little bit of a description here of each one. And down the bottom are some supplier sources, because a lot of these things are just not available locally. So I tend to buy them when I order my seeds online. And usually I have to buy them in 2 or 3, has been as much as 5-pound containers. But then if I keep them in the basement in those sealed coffee jars, the coffee tins, or some similar container, then I find most of them last for quite a while. The one caveat I say that is, if I overwinter, in storage, the top 3, the 3 grasses, grain grasses, I try to put them in the freezer for a couple weeks. The frost doesn't bother them, but it will kill the weevils. So it just breaks that cycle. But you may even have to do that once during the season too. But and then on the next page, page 6, I'm going to go over this right now. It's a cover crop management schedule, so you might want to keep that open and take some notes right there. So first of all, I'll go over a quick overview of what cover crops are. As the handout we just looked at, some containers that I just talked about. So, okay, I'll show you what these things look like in the field. That's a Thanksgiving Day picture of a crop of winter rye. Those that will overwinter fine, and it'll start growing again in the spring. One of the things about rye is it's one of the earliest things to start growing in the spring. So if you let it get too high, it's hard to manage. You're best off getting it before it's maybe a 1.5 foot high in the springtime. And that'll really depend on the heat that you generate over sometime. This is a fall crop of, I believe it's winter rye, and it's hairy vetch. So there's a grass and there's.
Girl,
Kung
Fu artist or something like that?
And I'll talk a little bit more about planting that. So I'm mix like that. Sometimes one germinates, the other one doesn't, just because of the conditions. And but then also the vetch will actually fix more nitrogen into the soil when there's a grass there to use it. So in other words, those bacteria kind of stop working if the soil gets saturated with nitrogen, which you actually see. This is probably a good picture of that's straight hairy vetch. So I'm not going to get as much nitrogen fixation there, even though the crop looks really nice, and as I will with the previous crop where I've got a mix. Clovers happens to be 2 beds of red clover in the background. It's a larger growing crop, more biomass, probably more nitrogen fixation. And these were both planted the previous year. I'll go into some planting schemes and techniques. In the front is a white clover, specifically was planted different than the red clover. It's not as aggressive. So actually that was underseeded under a cucurbit crop when that was growing. And they got a really good establishment. Don't get this establishment every year, but you can see there's a lot of biomass there. Think about what you get from your compost pile. If I went through and cut that off at ground level, that's a lot of compost. So I'm really adding a lot of nutrients to the soil. It's actually getting those nutrients from the soil, but it's also picking up carbon from sunlight, and particularly the red clover has a deep taproot, so that it is picking up nutrients that are more buried in the soil and bringing it to the surface where they're available for the next year. Okay, management schedule, we looked at it already. So planting, basically most of these things. Go ahead, Phil.
With those cover crops, you say that you don't till, so what do you do with those?
Oh, yeah, I don't. I'll get into that. Okay, so the question is, how do I manage that? If I don't answer your question by the time we get to the cover crops, ask me again. So planting is fairly simple. I just, almost all these things, I just take a handful and sprinkle them. Now, that will layer the seed on the surface of the soil. And most cover crops don't like to get buried. Think of a grass seed. Grass grows a stem and it just drops on the ground. Now, the dead plant, after it drops on the ground, shades it a little bit. So it does not like to be in really warm sunlight. But basically, a lot of these just like to be on the soil surface. So I might lightly rake with just with a rake, just to get them in a little bit, and not all of them are going to get buried. Some of them will get buried. It's kind of that same philosophy as when I was planting those small seeds. Some of it gets buried, some of it might not. Sometimes one will do better than the other. But then the important part is they want good ground contact. So I just take the back of my my rake, and I just tamp the soil down. So basically what I'm doing is if you don't tamp it, it may not have good ground contact, and it may get, it'll dry out a lot easier. So this is an example of something that worked really well. This was a spring crop of oats and what I call field peas. Field peas it's just a pea, but it's one that it's not bred for producing a lot of fruit. It's bred for producing a lot of green matter. And that same philosophy, I've got a legume, your peas, and I've got grass, so there's a symbiotic relationship. They were not buried. They were just tamped into the soil. And sometimes this will fail. Sometimes I do this before I see a rain coming, and you don't get that rain. So sometimes or you get a rain and then you get a dry period after that, and they may dry out. So they start to germinate, they dry out, they could die. So I don't get 100% every year of cover crop establishment, but I'm always planting some. If some things fail, then there's other alternatives. Now, one of those other alternatives is, let's say this failed, or in some cases, that particular oats and peas probably shouldn't let it go beyond May, and it's time to get it back into the soil. I'll talk about that, how to get back into the soil later. But let's say I'm not ready to plant anything in this bed yet. It's either going to be rested all summer long, or I may not be planting until, midsummer. So it gives me an opportunity for a second cover crop. And this is where another area where I use that floating row cover. This is, I've just planted a cover crop of buckwheat. Buckwheat is not a grass, it's not a legume, but it's a quick growing summer crop. And this will, again, keep the soil a lot more moist. So I get a bit of germination in the summertime, because that's what it's like. It's like hot weather. Certainly covering any of these with a little bit of mulch, not too much mulch, because you'll kill the seed as it comes out. But a little bit of mulch. Straw works really nice here because it gives a lot of airspace for that new seed to come up. This is clover seed that was planted in probably March or April. And this is probably mid-April, mid to late April. It's coming up through there, nice germination. This was an oat crop planted in early spring. I don't know exactly when, but pretty good germination, and that mulch helped it. Now, if you have a bed that's bare, you can take advantage of what I was talking about, the frost heaves that will pull those spinach roots out of the ground. And you see those cracks, that's what I'm talking about, frost heaves. So I think the bed that we saw planted in clover just coming up, this might have been the same bed, but this actually has clover seed that I sprinkled on it. So you can't see it, it's too small, but it's there. And if you notice, I don't know, a week or two later, you see that clover seeds coming up? It's coming up from those holes that were made by that frost heaving. So that particular part of that soil is more moist. It's an inch. Sometimes that goes down an inch, and it's created that little microclimate, I guess, that's more moist and it's partially shaded. So there are probably seeds that are sitting on top of that. The upper part of that soil, but they didn't germinate, or they haven't germinated yet, or not many of them have, some of them have. What's really successfully germinated is that crop that's fallen down into those frost heaves. So frost heaving is usually early March. It can start in February, and that was not too early to plant this clover seed. So, yes, ma'am. Usually, sometimes it's just some dead vines, and they don't get in the way. Yeah. So. Usually. So the question is, in the fall, basically, do you remove everything and then plant the cover crop? That is usually a yes to that, but I'll show you some exceptions that can extend your cover crop season. I'll get in. I'm showing you how to plant. Usually, now in this particular photo, and I may talk about this later, so I'll go through it quickly. So this is my cucurbit family again. I have enough room that I'm able to plant some that are quite spreading plants, like winter squashes and melons, pumpkins. Pumpkins are a little too aggressive, so I've gotten away from planting those. But if you remember from an hour ago, you saw that cucurbit bed when it was being planted. It was weed-free. And I'll talk a little bit about weeds in the next section. But I'm able to keep fairly weed-free until they start spreading like this. Now, when they start spreading like this, that creates a little bit of shadow on the soil. Sometimes it's too much, but I can sprinkle that clover, in this case it's clover, under those leaves, and I get germination like that. There may be some weeds in there, but those little plants you see in there are mostly clover. And I may have to water it a little bit more for the first few weeks, because Clover will germinate generally with one rainstorm. But if it dries out, it'll die. So I gotta make sure I can get some water there, and sometimes when you use a sprinkler, which I do use, sometimes those big leaves will shade the soil from getting water. You know, the water will run off those leaves, so there's something right underneath that leaf might not get any water, and so some of the clover might die. It's spotty. Sometimes I get, you know, a great standard clover, which you saw some examples of. And sometimes a lot of it dies, and it, you know, will die more maybe under the big leaf butternuts than it will under the small leaf melons. So hopefully that, and I'll get to the rest of your question. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, what's the benefit? But yeah, that's a good question. What are the benefits of cover crops? Well, they're multiple. One is it's using the nutrients that are in the top of the soil, so that over the wintertime, they're not going to percolate to the lower levels of the soil where they're just going to get into the water table. So that's number one. Number two is it's holding the soil in place, so it's not eroding. And then yes, three, all those nutrients that are in that cover crop are going to be, you can make them available to your plants the next year. When you, well, again, I'll show you how to manage them in a minute. So this is one scheme where it's a no to, do you need to get all the crop off before you plant? Yeah, and the other thing, if that clover gets well established, sometimes the squash, particularly the winter squash, can sit on a bed of clover rather than on the ground, and sometimes it sits on the ground. It has some rotting effects. And then my early crop of lettuce, peas, etc., were in that bed that's right next to it. As I take that out, I plant clover in there too. So yeah, this was a whole bed of clover and cilantro and other early planted things. But I pull it out, get that cover crop established, and as those vines spread, they're going to spread to that area too. So I sometimes, when it works out well, I end up with 3 beds in the fall of a nice standard clover. So here's another note to your question: if they need to get everything out of the ground. Generally, this is my tomato patch, and you saw earlier pictures of it where it's all green right down to the ground level. And this is fall. The diseases, particularly, I'll talk about diseases later, but they start to take over, and they work from the ground up. So those leaves start to fall off, die at the bottom. But what it does is it opens up some sunlight. So I planted a crop of rye and hairy vetch. The rye is the grass-like looking thing. There is some hairy vetch in there, but it's kind of hard to see. It's slow to germinate. So there is a cover crop in here, and the tomatoes are still growing. Now, if I took another photo of the top of the tomatoes, it's still green, there's still fruit up there. So it's not like they're completely dead. You don't have to wait that long, but I probably planted this in early September. And so those tomatoes are going to stay in there for another month and a half, probably. But I am getting some cover crop established. And by that time, the root system of tomatoes is so extensive that I'm not worried about, taking nutrients away from them, particularly in the latter part of their life. Okay, so yeah, again, I'll run through some of it again. Rye, generally the planting dates for that are the fall, and it can be planted right until early November. I lived in Vermont for a while. I planted in mid-November, and I still got a cover crop established in Vermont. And I thought, well, it's not going to do any good. But you know what? It was a little bit of a hillside, and I think I harvested something late, so I didn't get that rye established on there. And it was remarkably, even though in the spring those plants were only about that big, it was remarkably how that little plant held the soil in place. The place on the same slope that I didn't plant that rye, it had remarkably significant erosion. But not where those little seedlings were growing. So, but then this was probably planted early spring. Again, this is a Thanksgiving photo. This is what that cover crop that you just saw a minute ago in the tomatoes looks like a few weeks later. Yeah, again, the hairy vetch, late fall, mid-fall probably. Hairy vetch can be planted and usually is planted with a grass, usually winter rye. And hairy vetch is a little more fussy about when it gets planted. It's not as hardy. So if you're going to mix the two, Try to get the veg in by mid-September, September 15th. Now, I've stretched that a little bit. And one thing about vetch is vetch is a little ball. The seed is a little ball, and it's a very hard seed. So sometimes it doesn't germinate really well because it's so protective of what's inside that seed that it takes a lot to germinate. So if you do what's called scarifying the seed, which is putting it in a little, sorry for these folks at home, I just have a little container here, and I have some hairy veg seed in there, and I got a couple pebbles. So hopefully you can hear that. All I need to do is shake them up, and I'm scratching the surface of the veg seed. So it really increases its ability to germinate. Yeah, just a little trick, but quite helpful. Okay, this is oats. Oats, again, can be planted in the fall. The difference between oats and rye, they're both a grass, but oats will not overwinter. So this is probably planted on a bed that I hope to plant something fairly early in the spring. If it dies over the winter, then I don't have to worry about managing that, killing that cover crop in one way or another in order to get planted here. And sometimes this works well enough that I can just, I really don't have to till much. I can just basically pull the dead oat aside and make a furrow, and I have a mulch that's already established. Now, if I didn't get to plant the oats in the fall, or I have a bed that I was hoping that it was a late harvest or something like that, and I didn't get to plant the cover crop. It's also a very early growing crop in the spring, as are what I call field peas. Now, field peas can be your old peas that you bought a couple of years ago, and you say, I got to refresh my seed, but there's still a lot left. But there are specific field peas that are made for cover crops. Some of them will overwinter. I think most of them will not, although I think that some of the mild winters we've had recently, they all overwinter. But this is a combination of oats and field peas that I probably put in March. I planted a bunch of beds like this because I had some late harvest last year already in March this year. And I asked you how your peas were doing. Mine, I see them starting to swell up, but I can't tell if they're going to make it through or not. They could have started to germinate and dried out, but I think they will. And I've got oats room. So usually the oats are a little more reliable. If the field peas don't make it, then the oats will. So at least I get one of the two cover crops in here. So this is a cover crop that will grow till probably May sometime, and then I will manage it, which I'll get into how to manage it in a minute. A little bit different slide from that same bed. It's you can see the peas a little more clear from that. One of the side benefits of planting these field peas as a cover crop is this is basically just a pea shoot. And pea shoots is really edible. You go to fancy restaurants and they'll have pea shoots as part of the salad. And so we fill up bowls of these. When we get a good pea crop established, we'll fill up bowls of these. This is one of our first vegetable crops in the spring. They're all edible. They're sweet. They're really great. So again, clover that was established the year before. So I think I told you my two main avenues of planting this. One is to underseed the cucurbits or to seed early crops as they come out of the ground. The other is that frost seeding that I showed you. So I've covered that already. And then you can see that this well-established bed of clover, I've got those. I think that's particularly a melon crop that's crawling towards the clover. It's going to produce fruit in there. And hopefully the fruit will lay right on top of the clover. Clover, the white clover, that was red clover. The white clover it's more of a spreading. It'll spread by sending out shoots. So it can make a good crop for pathways. This is white clover that you can see right there. Eventually I've had some grasses kind of get in here, and some of them which I consider weeds. But, plant them in one of the ways I've said before, just to frost seed or plant cover with mulch, and you can get a good crop established there. I got them next to my blueberries, so they actually will crawl into the blueberries. But basically, I just trim them back once or twice a year and throw that in the compost pile. Crimson clover is another thing that's on your list. It's more of an annual. So if I had a clover crop I wanted to get established, but I thought, well, maybe I want to plant that early next spring, I might use crimson clover. Beautiful crop too. I mean, beautiful plant. I found that it doesn't 100% winter kill, but most winters it has. Might be getting a change. And sometimes, again, using that same concept of planting a grass with a legume, this clover is actually planted with what I call perennial ryegrass, which is the type of grass you'll find in a lawn, not necessarily in a farm field. So it's a tufting grass. This is pretty much what it would look like. And I have to keep that cut back because otherwise it'll produce seed. And the seed, maybe I don't want that seed there for next year. If anybody wants to try some of this, if I convince you by the end of the session that you want to try this, the seed is probably 5 years old, but I had to buy a 5-pound bag, I think. So if anybody wants to try a little bit, take it home. So the reason, the reason for mixing it in is I'm creating a little bit of a grass that will use that nitrogen being fixed by the legume, produce more nitrogen, and actually it produces a lot more biomass. One of the and then it's established in some of my pathways. This is a pathway that's not clear of weeds because I like to let, if I see this perennial ryegrass or clover growing in my pathways, usually I'll let it go. I'll just weed around it because I keep cutting it back and using it. In this particular case, I used it for mulch for the garlic early on in the season, but I could take it to the compost pile or use it for mulch elsewhere. So one other, again, it's not grass, not a legume, but is what I call cover crop radishes. So they will establish in the fall. They'll die over the winter time, but this type of daikon radish. And if you don't grow them, you've probably seen them in the store. They're long, they're usually larger than a carrot. This is probably planted late enough. I'm going to not get that long root, and I think they're planted too thickly. But you plant them by August, I guess. So it's kind of an earlier cover crop, maybe September. You'll get that long daikon, and that'll die over the winter time. So what you end up with is you get that organic matter that you brought down like that far into the soil, and it's going to rot, and it's going to create this airspace for, it just makes your soil lighter. If you have really heavy soil, they work really well. But sprinkle it. This is, I loaned some seed to a friend, and he used the whole package, which is a big jar like that on a small bed. Use too much of it, but if you sprinkle it a lot more sparingly than this, you'll get those daikons. Okay, so again, this is I think it's kind of a repeat. This buckwheat, it's a summer crop. I covered it with a remay with this flowing row cover. Just keep the moisture in there. Take the row cover off. It's starting to germinate. But if you see in the front, it's a little bit lighter soil than it is just maybe an eighth of the way up the screen. That front wasn't covered because it didn't have a large enough row cover, and it just happened to be a season where it had enough rain. It germinated just as well under the row cover as it did not under the row cover. So this is maybe a week or two. It's quick germinator, maybe 2 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. And eventually it will fill in the whole area. It's a succulent crop, so it's fairly easy to manage as far as maybe just hoeing it. But it should be you should do something with this as a cover crop when 10% of those flowers are in bloom. Now, how do you know when 10% is? Well, if you wait till it's 100% blooming, then you go back a week. That's when it was 10%. But there's a few blooms in there, and so this is the best time to get rid of it. Now, one of the reasons this is the best time is this canopy has, this is not the thickest stand I've ever had. Actually, this is probably a thicker stand, but this is probably, 75% boom. So I should have done this a week ago. I should have cut it back a week ago. So this is the stage where it creates the greatest canopy. Buckwheat is also a weed suppressor because it creates such a thick canopy. It's such a quick grow that weeds that are germinating underneath it, these small weeds, they're going to die. They're just not going to get enough sunlight. So this looks like it's sticking up. It probably wasn't too late, but I should have done it. Now I'm going to try to get into the management of these. So how do you manage, how do you incorporate the soil? Now, this is that buckwheat crop we just saw. There was too much biomass in there for me to go through and just use a hoe. A hoe is a way you can incorporate all these, but depends upon how much top growth you get. It's even if I cut this with a scythe. Again, I don't use a lawnmower, and I have to have a scythe, machete. I would probably have a hard time working that soil. So I generally will cut it with the scythe. This another really nice bit of clover, and I'll bring a lot of it to the compost pile. It's a decision I'll make. If I can get through it easily and chop it up, fine. But if I can't, I'll bring it to the compost pile, and it's going to be a good addition to the compost pile. Or I could pull it aside and use it as a mulch elsewhere in the garden. This one again is a mulch from probably early onion crops. But eventually I've got to get in there. Well, there are other ways to do this, but with a hoe, this is one of those areas where maybe I could use that clear plastic in the summertime to kill that crop. I don't have a lot of experience with that yet, but I'd like to learn more about it, because then I don't have to hoe it all. I have to disturb the soil. And as I mentioned before, any mycorrhizal fungus that's in the soil, which is going to be beneficial to me, when I hoe it, it kind of kills it. So it's got to go back from scratch. Doesn't hurt the bacteria, but it does. So some of these things are easy. Clover is not, and some of these grasses, basically, I kind of have to hoe in a way that I cut the grass clumps into smaller pieces, and then try to break those up the best I can. Sometimes I'm just ending up with a clump on top of my soil. So most of these cover crops, when I prepare the soil, I try to start a month ahead of time when we're going to plant. And I'm trying to do this about every week. So this might be as far as I can go. Now, to give you an idea, I'm fairly fit, and I like gardening because I like exercise. So my beds are about 30 feet long and about 3.5 feet wide. So a cover crop like this, it may take me a half hour to 40 minutes to do it the first time. But then each successive time, by the time I'm done with my last home, if I've done it right, I've done it 4 times. It only takes about 5 minutes. So yeah, it is some hard exercise, but take your time. You don't have to do it all at once. So where's that decision of when I can just go in there and hoe, maybe cut and hoe, or just hoe the crop? This is probably rye and vetch. It's about 1 foot high. So at this point, in this particular bed, I think it was the one you just saw, I didn't cut this at all. I just hoed it as it was. So some of those stems it's leaving, in a fairly long state. And if you have a lawnmower and you're not a person using a lawnmower, you go in and cut it, and it'll break it into small pieces. So it'll be a lot easier working with. So I don't. So I make that decision once it's gotten to be 2 foot high. Then I'm going to take that off and bring most of it to the compost pile. So I've taken away some of my nutrients that I could put back into the soil, but I'm bringing them back eventually I'll bring them back from the compost pile. So this would be a bed of clover. Clover is not a grass. It doesn't have those little tufts of clumps of soil. It's a little bit easy to manage. It's after its first time. You see a lot of first hoeing. It's got a lot of green in there. And this is about a week after the second hoeing. I still haven't killed all the clover yet, but I've killed a lot of it. And this is after a first hoeing of a bed of oats, either oats or rye, either oats or peas or oats and hairy vetch. I don't remember which. First hoeing, a lot of green in the air, a lot of stems. So I want to talk a little bit about the short perennial ryegrass. This happens to be a bed where the ryegrass got established well, the clover didn't, so it was predominantly ryegrass, and I should have cut it back before then. Just it's a lawn plant, so you cut it back, it won't seed. You let it go, it will seed. But when you chop it up, it's really got those tight tufts of grass. It's just like turning of a well-established lawn for the first time, and you can't always break those up. I can hoe it a few times. Sometimes I get a lot of decomposition, but I still end up with a tuft like this. So if I've hoed this 3 or 4 times and I want to plant, basically what I do is I rake those tufts over to the side of the bed, and they become a mulch for the side of the bed. I can bring them, once I've got a plant established, I can bring them back up. They're pretty well dead here. I don't think they're going to grow back, but yeah, again, they'll, you can't always get rid of them. They're hard to manage. Okay, so this is our poor hoeing. This thing, it's been about a month. I don't remember what cover crop was in here, but it's pretty much ready to plant. So again, I'm going to go through my rake it flat, and go ahead and it's ready to plant. Did I answer all your questions? Okay, thanks. Any other questions? Because what I do want to take a minute to just see that we've yes, ma'am. Go ahead. That's right. No questions are. Yeah. Yeah. Well, if it's in the way of the plants, I would get rid of it. But if it's just growing in an idle area, it's good. Now, some of the vetch that might be growing there, there's a different type of vetch they plant on roadsides. I don't remember the name of it, but it grows a little bit differently. It could be that some wild seed. Or have you planted vetch? Do you think it's just left over? Yeah, it could be because if you've gotten straw in the past. Straw and hairy vetch, a lot of grains and hairy vetch will be planted together, or hairy vetch will be used in the field that eventually has a grain in it, and they're harvested at the same time. So the vetch becomes kind of a weed in the grain, and mechanically on a large scale they can take those out, but it's not easy. But sometimes when you get straw in, it's got some hairy vetch seed in there too, so it might have become established. Yeah, it is considered a weed in a grain crop, but yeah, it's probably perfectly good in the field. Okay, so this is we've gardened in our current location for since around 2006, and the 2 things I want you to look at are fairly much in the middle, the lower part of the screen. One where it says organic matter. So this is after the first year of gardening, our organic matter was 3.3%. And if you look on that same line way over to the left, it says soil pH is 6.7%. So aside from the fact that I did add some things the first year, some compost or whatever, it's kind of what I started out with. So this is 15, I think. So that would be after about 10 years of gardening. The only thing that I worry about there is potassium. Actually, potassium is not as stable of a nutrient. In other words, it decomposes fairly quickly. So showing low levels in the fall is not usually as much of an issue as if it's low in the middle of the summer, because you can add it in the form of compost or whatever, and it'll be higher, but it'll get used up or it'll leach. So I'm not as concerned about that. But let's see, one of those, it's a little hard to read, was from IAM, but the second to the last line is organic matter. It's 5.7. So in this management program that I've gone through, I've raised my organic matter by 2.5 percentage points. So what's the advantages there? Organic matter acts like a sponge in the soil. It holds moisture. It creates a more aerated soil, so it absorbs water rather than having it puddle and all run off. And it's source of nutrients. So I want to get that. This is really good. I see that organic matter going up. and I think well, I can't read it, at least for me, I think the top line says soil pH, it says 7.1. So I went from 6.7 to 7.1. And this is when I started talking to the soil agronomist, records, agronomist, they said, yeah, take the chicken eggshells out of there, and I stopped putting the shells, the clam shells on. And I have gotten it down to 6.7 is what it tested this fall. So I've made some success there. So this is a private testing lab. I like to use them. They give some good results, but I've sent that same soil sample to Rutgers, and they give an equally good test. Now, I'm told, and I don't know this for a fact, but I'm told when you submit a soil sample to Rutgers, tell them you're a farm, because if you're not, they may not give you I think it's the organic matter. To me, that's the main thing I want to know. That and my pH are the two main things I want to know here, because I'm not worried so much about my nutrients. I can add those with compost, but I am worried about my continually raising my soil pH. I mean, lowering my soil pH and raising my organic matter. So tell a little white lie and say you're farm. Say make me want to farm. So this is the soil test from the raspberries, which I've never added any compost to, just leaves. Again, the pH at the top is 7.3. So you think of like leaves as being acidic when, well, they may be during the breakdown process, but once they're fully decomposed, they actually make the soil more alkaline. And I kind of learned that the hard way with this. So be careful of your pH if you're just using leaves. But my organic matter down the bottom is 7.4. So, that's even almost 2 points higher than it is for my garden beds. Mary, how are we doing in time?
How many what?
How are we doing with time?
We've got about 30 minutes.
Okay, so I have another session. I guess it's going to take a few minutes. You want to go to the bathroom or get something or to drink? Fine, but the last session is going to be on pests. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Is that what? No, it's out. Yeah. And most plants will like a little bit of acidic soil. So like 6.5, I guess they say 6.5 is ideal, but 6.5 is but if you get a lot of organic matter too, I'm told that it's kind of a buffer, so that it's okay. Yeah. Have you tested your?
Does she have him like going someplace?
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. I always think of my mom.
Yeah, I don't know exactly. I think they keep it a little more acidic than just regular leaves. But yeah, but if the calcium is kind of what gives a lot of structure to leaves, and I think part of this and so when it's broken down, that calcium is still in the soil. That will raise the pH. I don't know about pine needles. I do use pine. I use Christmas tree. I shredded Christmas trees for mulch my blueberries, but I also add a little bit of sulfur to keep the soil
Some of this club.
pH lower.
What do you
Blueberries
do?
like
Great,
that.
see Linda, when she
Oh yeah,
was there.
yeah.
That's why I keep thinking, I need to call her, find the time. Oh, awesome.
He goes to work.
Yeah. Yeah, Bud can figure that one out. Tell her I said hi, big hug, and yeah, tell her I need to cough like someday,
Lucky.
yeah, do lunch.
Sure.
Maybe, or,
Oh,
or
thanks.
breakfast or
Yeah,
something.
we'll pick, somebody, she really cook a lot, you know, 'cause she's not eating.
Yeah,
And we have a trip salad
You
and
won't be
something
organic.
that- He's just fruit. I think she said 2 to-
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Oh, here's the handout. Rick.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, oh, yeah.
We'll be able
I'll
to
double
see the video online.
yeah, she usually sends it.
Was he here in the past?
He's got-
Oh, yeah.
I probably saw.
Yeah.
He has so much information.
Yes. Yeah, one more time. Oh, that's right.
You know, we'll pick up
Well, I would be careful using fresh compost. So what I, yeah, what I often use that as a
Yeah.
main source of compost, particularly in the middle of the summer, when, you know, or in the fall, when you get a lot of brown, putting a lot of brown in. Brown is high in carbon, chicken manure and green is high in nitrogen. So that,
Yeah.
mixing the two together helps, it helps with the compost process along.
Yeah. It
I'm
does not.
not so glad. Well, she thinks she's a little, she's a dry, so they don't use it that often.
Yeah.
My wife said,
It's an
Annie
expense.
would take it.
It's an expense and
Yeah,
it was an expense and a worry.
yeah.
And then she's baby.
okay.
For sure.
That's a lot
The
too.
one thing way up is,
So I'm ready when you guys are.
I think the real recommend she charge more. And if she gets it, it'll be enough. They don't have to go down. and clean it.
They get something, yeah.
So
That's what the guy
What's
above
that?
us,
The guy
yeah.
above, the guy above us rents for 3,000.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm ready when everybody else is.
We're at
we're
37th
closer
in
to the beach.
Asbury, but it's a 2 floor, the condo, you know, like the
A lot of people going out.
second floor, you know, like, but yeah, they're back on West for like Asbury, next one up and next, yeah. But that's what he does too, because he lives in Pennsylvania and, you know, has somebody. This cleaning crew comes in and, you know, you figure it all out, yeah, so she can make,
Yeah, she,
wait till the end of the
I
season.
think that it used to be a partnership. She's doing everything.
Yeah.
I think she's like transitioning over to thinking.
And it's just,
You know,
it-
it's like so much time. It's not fun to do everything yourself.
yeah,
I know.
She is. dragging.
all right. We'll see, yes, we're off to, yeah, off on it.
Yeah, yeah, I don't know if we'll see you Saturday for the,
Oh, not this Saturday, no. Will be next
This is the
first.
plant sale. Get too much. Come by. We're 22nd, 23rd, 23rd. It's the training building.
Okay, I'll get started, as I know we don't have a lot of time.
yeah.
So I'm talking about
Yeah,
pests.
you go down.
Now,
to
pests can be
university.
both insects or it can be disease. And I want to touch on some prevention methods first.
From our walk.
So, and some of these I'll more of a retouch. Prevention, disease prevention, in tomatoes, we talked about stationing them up. You want to keep them off the ground because a lot of disease, particularly leaf blight, comes in from the ground up. So keep them safe. Talked about eggplant before. I don't plant because I know I'm going to get too many flea beetles and not good ways to control flea beetles organically. But some of you have planted it and it's been fine. That's fine. It's an individual thing. I try to rotate. I mentioned my crop families. I'll not plant the same thing. I try to keep it away for 3 years in a row. And there's some things I like to keep even longer. I'll talk a little bit about. And then sometimes I plant at different times of the year. I mentioned I don't plant brassicas because in the spring, even though there's some great fall
I
brassica,
like
spring
that.
brassicas, particularly some of your Chinese
Oh,
leafy vegetables, really early crop. They are in that brassica family, and they can be bothered by flea beetles. But when I plant for a fall crop, this is kale, it's a bit of kale, there's cabbage in there, cauliflower and broccoli, and I plant them in, well, I seed them in pots, put them on a front porch which gets full sunlight in early July. And then they're ready to transplant out in late July. And so this is taken, I believe the date on this photo was October 10th. See, there's plenty of kale there, and if you had a shot from the other end, the broccoli heads are about that big. Usually, they're ready by mid to late. The broccoli heads are usually ready by mid to late October. So and I don't have the flea beetle pest. And fencing, I do a whole module, an hour-long talk on fencing. I'll just touch on it in a way to keep your critters out. Your fence does not actually have to be 8 feet high in order to keep deer. It depends upon how big of an area you have. If your area is the only green area around, and your fence is only 5 or 6 feet high, the deer can easily jump that, but they generally won't, unless your irrigated crops, whatever, on the inside is the only green around. Then they will jump it. They can jump it, and they generally can't jump an 8 foot high fence. I have a 6 foot high fence around my own garden, and I take care of our church's garden, which has a 5 foot fence. But I've never had a problem with that 5 foot fence. The deer have never jumped it. And I kind of inherited that one. I probably would have put a 6 footer in, but it's worked fine. You ask about the row cover, some of the other uses of the row cover. I think I might have been, this particular one, I think I might have been using it to keep the soil cool and moist. But some of your insects we'll get into later, particularly striped cucumber beetle. Cucumbers will grow under this. It gets enough sunlight that the beetles won't get in there, and they can't. Again, I'll talk about cucumber beetle damage in a bit, but basically it's a way of excluding. People have tried it with the flea beetle. It works somewhat, but usually they find a way to get in there. I don't know how, but they seem to find a way to get in there. So if you have trouble with flea beetles in the early planted crop, you could try it. Weeds, mulch, perfect way. That was mulch in the pathways. That's how I keep a lot of the weeds down. But then around the plants too, it holds in moisture, but it'll hold the weeds down. This particular mulch is not on thick enough to really do much for the weeds, so I would have to add something in there. I probably did it just to keep the soil a little bit more moist, so it wouldn't be hot and dry. Because as I told you, I plant these. This is a brassica plant. I plant these in midsummer, in late July, so the soil can often be pretty hot and dry quickly. So I think that was the reason I put that mulch on, not to control weeds, but it does. Black plastic, I don't really use it, but it is an effective weed control. I just find it's not necessarily a sustainable practice, but it is effective on holding the weeds back. So it's in different colors. I'm told red is some kind of reflection on red that's beneficial for tomatoes, but I've never, again, I don't use it. I haven't used it. And then we talked about buckwheat. Buckwheat is a weed control because it gets so thick, it will basically shade out perennial weeds. Some, not ones that are strong enough like thistle. It has thistle has a really strong root system, but it will, a lot of your grasses, it will shade out. There are ways to, these are called sticky traps. They're usually available in some of those catalogs. You'll catch some of your insects, particularly, again, the cucumber beetle is another example. It likes yellow flowers. Cucumbers have yellow flowers. It's attracted to yellow. So sometimes you can catch them on. The disadvantage of this is you've got some beneficial insects there that you may catch also. So you may be deleting that population. Okay, back to flea beetles again. Flea beetles actually, favorite brassica is actually daikon radishes. And I think there's even varieties of daikon radish that they prefer over others. So you could plant these early in the season if you're planting other brassicas as a trap crop. So in other words, your majority of the flea beetles may go to these daikon radishes rather than bothering your eggplant or your early fall brassicas. Now, what you do with them, whether you just let them go or you maybe use some take those leaves away or use an organic spray. Organic sprays don't work real well on the flea beetles, but try it. If you have a problem and you want to put it in there. Other things, of course, is interplanting with flowers. This is I think it's a marigold that have some what do you call repellent properties. They work okay. I don't know that they're completely reliable, but if you like flowers, it's nice to interplant them with crops. And then there's the encouragement of your beneficials. I just heard talking about spotted lanternflies. I got some beautiful pictures in the fall of spotted lanternfly being eaten by one of these things, and it's got the spotted lanternfly in its claws, and its head is gone, and the praying mantis is sucking the juices out of that spotted lanternfly. Now you sound like you have such a large infestation that. $1,700. Wow. Yeah, and I'm not going to cover spotted lanternfly. It's such it's such a new thing in my raising things. But I know the spotted lanternfly traps, things like that. But and I don't have in my area. I don't have nearly the pressure that you might with your 1,700 sightings in a month. Oh, grapes, yeah, grapes, yeah. Yeah. Grapes is one of the spotted lanternfly's favorite. I don't have grapes. They don't seem to bother my annual crops. I've told that like summer squash is the one that they, maybe one of the more favorite ones. What's that? Oh, figs. Oh, yeah. That picture I have of that praying mantis eating, it was on a fig tree. So I guess, and I see some of these on that fig tree in the fall. Unfortunately, they don't get to the size where they can really do much control until the fall, because a praying mantis is an annual, it lays its overwinters as an egg, and it's a lot of praying mantis or spider man. Yeah. Oh yeah. 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 So Bill, for those of you online, Bill said, yeah, he found a lot in Christmas trees, and his son collected them and threw them all over. Yeah, it's great. Okay, so some other techniques you can use. Does anybody know what this plant is? Yes, Queen Anne lace. Yeah. So Queen Anne lace is a member of the Bifida family, which includes lettuces and carrots and probably a bunch of other flowers. And I have this growing wild around in the garden. But if you look on there, you see probably about 3 or 4 different types of insects. I don't know what they all are, but there are a lot of particularly beneficial wasps that this is a nectar source for them. And so they will be attracted to the garden, and then they will parasitize some of the insects in my garden. They may parasitize some of the beneficials too, but they are beneficial. So I like to keep these, around the edges of the garden, yeah, it's quite. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, what were they?
Queen Anne's lace. Queen Anne's lace. Yeah, it's just a wild flower, and it's often called wild carrot. It doesn't have an edible root, but it's got a root like a carrot. Anybody know what this one is? Yeah, baby ladybug. So a lot of people don't recognize this and see it, and they want to squash it or something like that. But don't. This is I think the stage of the ladybug that eats most insects. So it, it's really beneficial. It moves around a lot faster than an adult. That's an adult. But I don't think they eat as, I don't think they do the same versus, try that word, the same eating patterns. Other things you encourage, purple martin, barn swallows. I know there's a bunch of people in farms in New Jersey that are they're putting in barn houses now, but that's more for, not for insects, more for other types of control. Turtles, we happen to be next to a state park, so we seem to have a abundance of turtles. They particularly like slugs. I was going down the driveway one day, and my wife was back of me, so I stopped to pick the turtle up that was in the middle of the driveway. I was afraid she was going to hit it, and something slimy was hanging out of its mouth. So I went back home that night, and I looked up my son's reptile book. Box turtles, what's their favorite food? And slugs and snails are like one of the top 3 favorite foods. So this is not in my garden, it's on the outskirts, but I found that those slugs come in from the grassy area from the side. And, I just try to encourage these guys. I take photos of their next door neighbors have little kids. I take photos of the shells. So they're all like fingerprints. They're all different. So I've got 9 different ones that I can actually name that I see. I used to think it was just one. But no, there are a bunch of them around. That's a natural control. So this is actually a poor photo, but it's fall brassicas that were not taken care of, and you can see how the damage. Some of those leaves are bare. The green on the leaves has been eaten. So if you don't keep up with things can get kind of bad. But there are insects that you have to deal with. Okay, so I'm going to try to go through some insects. It's a leaf miner. This is a tomato plant. I don't know if they really do much damage on tomato plants, but if you follow that line, that maze backwards, you can see it starts out as a really thin line. So it's some insect they lay their eggs, I think, within the layers of top and bottom layer of the leaf, and it eats its way through the leaf. So eventually it gets to be a big hole. Again, not as much problem on tomatoes, but particularly spinach and early chard. Sometimes that will create a lot of damage, and those leaves they're not sellable. You can still pick out the bad spots and eat the rest of them, but they only last for a couple of weeks. So if your early spinach has them and you can control, you can squash them. You can actually see where the insect it's bulged out, so you can actually squash that insect and it'll die, but it won't get rid of the damage. Another early one is cutworm. It's particularly a threat for tomatoes, peppers, that family, because that's the time of year when these worms get to be big. A lot of times, if you have had problems in the past and you want to prevent it, if you plant your tomato plants in a cup, this is probably too small, the one I have here, but like an 8-ounce or bigger Dixie cup or a yogurt cup or something like that. The cutworm, it actually burrows a hole into the soil. Spends a day, crawls back up, and then goes looking for a plant. And it wraps itself around it, so that's why it's called cutworm. It cuts the plant off at the base, which is exactly what happened here. So it won't climb up that paper cup. Sometimes you can grow or buy your tomato seedlings, for instance, in a plastic cup. And you probably can cut the bottom out of that and just and plant it in that. That would do the same thing. I actually, again, I don't grow my own tomato seedlings. I buy them from a farmer at a farmer's market, and I get them when they're fairly large size and when they're probably is thick. The stem is as thick as my finger. It's probably not as much of a threat as when they're small. But there are ways to deal with that. Again, flea beetles. We talked about several controls. The daikon radish is a trap, and then I try not to plant early. Try not to plant these brassica plants early. This is not actually a planted brassica plant. It's actually a mustard, which is in this particular case is a weed. But that's part of that same family too. So if you have mustard as a weed, it'll attract the flea beetles. And maybe it'll be a track crop. Maybe they'll go there first. I'm not sure. Colorado potato beetle. One of your next ones coming up. This is the adult stage. I think the adult stage is still eating, although it goes through 4, I forget, instar stages. They do most of the eating of the leaves. They'll eat the leaves. They won't eat the tubers, but when you eat the leaves, you're cutting down on your crop yield. If you have a small patch, you can find these seeds. This is the seeds from the eggs from a Colorado potato beet. You can squish those so you can get plant control. If they hatch out again, this is one of the larval stages. I don't think it's actually called a larval, it's a type of bug. It doesn't have a larval stage, one of the instars. This is when it does most of the damage, but they're really slow. You can go, if you have a small patch, you go hand pick them. The natural control I tried when I was farming, it was kind of expensive, but it worked pretty well, is that bran, so oat bran, wheat bran, if you sprinkle that on your plants when you start to see these things, in the morning, when you get a little bit of dew on the plant, it sticks to the plant. And when the Colorado potato beetle eats it, it's dry, but it what do you call it? It expands in its stomach and it'll kill it from the inside out. So I actually tried that one year. I tried it on all beds except for like 2. This is, again, when I was farming. It had about an 80% control. It didn't have 100% control. It had about an 80% control. But again, bran is not the cheapest thing in the world. Potato leafhopper can be another problem in potatoes. And I'm going to talk about a couple of potential organic sprays that I used. I actually have never used it on this, but this particular year, they kind of got away from me. It was the worst I'd seen. But I'll talk about specific ones. Okay, your cucumber beetles, your striped and your spotted cucumber beetles are about the same lifestyle, and they are a sucking insect. So it's not going to eat the leaf. It's not going to eat the fruit. But what it does is it sucks the juices out of one plant. And there is a disease called cucumber bacterial wilt. I think it'll affect other cucumber plants, but it's worse on the cucumbers. And if it sucks the juice out of one that has been infected with that, and it goes to another, it's going to bring that disease to the other plant. And you'll recognize this, and the cucumbers all look healthy one day, and then a couple of days later, one of them just kind of collapsed. It just looks really, and then you got to start worrying about it. This keeping this row cover over those plants until they get to the flowering stage. You got to take them away when they flower because they need to be pollinated. But that'll give them a head start, and it'll probably cut out some of your damage. I find I'm not in an area where there's a lot of farms, so I don't think there's I don't have much of a population of cucumber beetles, so I don't do anything, but you may have a vegetable farm next door, and you may have some fairly high populations. Now, cucumber beetles are very active in the daytime. You can't really catch them. If you have a small patch, you can go out at night with a headlamp or a flashlight. I like a headlamp because it leaves you both hands open. And you can find those striped cucumber beetles. They're not very active at night, so you can actually squish them. I use this to catch slugs in the fall too. Slugs like when you get those cold nights that are heavy dew. Slugs move around a lot, and they start to get to be big from eating all year long. So you can start to catch them. But I go out at night when I can see them. They come out hiding. Okay, your squash borer. This another thing that will make the plant collapse. It's a butterfly, I believe, or a moth. I'm not sure. It lays its eggs at the base of a plant. Now, its 2 favorite crops are Hubbard squash, which is a winter squash, and your family of summer squashes. And so I plant butternut squash instead of Hubbard. as my winter squash because I don't get that problem. But I do plant summer squashes. I don't plant a lot, but I plant some. And there are several things I've used. I have tried, garlic is an insect, it has insecticidal properties, it has insect repellent properties. That's why it's not a good insecticide, because it repels. But I often will take a little, what do you call it, a clove of garlic, and I'll just squish it as best I can, and I'll rub it around the bottom of that plant. And I'll do it at a certain time. I'll talk about the time later. But I'm hoping that that will kill anything that may have been laid there already as it emerges. The seeds are laid not in the plant, they're laid at the base of the plant. And those little, whatever they are, larvae, they hatch and then they burrow into the plant. And you can often see that burrow because it looked like sawdust, somebody's pushing sawdust out from the middle of the plant. You can kind of see some of that sawdust looking area. Looks like the image might have started from down the root, but these guys are going to destroy this plant pretty quickly. Now, my first thing I will do if I see this problem is I will cut the stem, but I don't cut it. Think of the way the veins in the stem are going. They're going parallel to the way it's growing. So if I cut it in a line, I am probably cutting through some of those veins. So I'm hurting it a little bit, but I'm not killing the plant. These guys are going to kill the plant if I let them go. Quite often, I can find them in there. I can destroy them, and they don't have a second generation during the year. So I've saved the plant. It may have, maybe not, but if I go further down that vine where it still looks healthy, and I kind of mound soil up around it, it'll start to grow new roots here. So it'll pick up, knock it back, but it won't completely die. I'm going to get back to the squash bugs in a minute. Now, the squash vine borer. Squash bugs, you'll often see them. Some years I have them, some years I don't. Very distinctive, they're clusters. So this is a good one to try some of the organic sprays on, because you don't have to spray the whole area. You can just spray this one leaf. They're all on that one leaf, and this leaf will quickly die and look like that. And then they go on to another leaf. And soon your whole plant will look like this. So you got to do something. They're really too quick. Sometimes you can hand squash them, but they're a little too quick. But they also start from these little eggs on the bottom of the plant. So if you start to see some, they don't all hatch at the same time. So this particular one, I already have squashed some. You see little remains of squash plants there. I mean, squash bugs. But there is more that will hatch. So I found the source of them, then I'll just squeeze those and kill them all. Yeah, so I guess this is what that looked like as I found that. There's some that are already hatched out, and then I took care of those by hand, and then I had the others to deal with. So your Mexican bean beetle, it's again, I don't often have problems with this, but this is the adult stage. I think most of the again, you can find in the beans, if you find these seeds, it's probably the Mexican bean beetle, so squash them. And this is what its larva looks like. And it's very slow moving, so you can do a lot of hand picking. If they get to this stage, they probably will have done some damage. You'll probably see the holes in the leaves. So, but you probably could try some of the organic sprays, but I think that if you don't have a big patch, you could probably do a lot of hand picking. Your tobacco or your tomato hornworm, sometimes you can actually hear these guys chewing. You'll notice it because you may have a healthy looking tomato patch, but all of a sudden you go, there's leaves that are missing there. And then you look really carefully, they're well camouflaged, but you can find some in there. So you can do several things. They're big, they're slow moving. You can squish them, you can feed them to your fish if you have an aquarium. And if you leave them, usually you will get a parasitic wasp that'll parasitize it, and it'll kill it this way. So sometimes it's a question. If I see a really full grown one, do I leave it and hope that I get some parasitic wasps that will kill it. Because I like the population of my wasps to multiply. And but if I squish it, maybe I'm knocking that back. It's a trade-off. But usually when they get to the really large size, they're eating so fast that I usually do just squeeze them. Your European corn borer, I think it may be the same insect or a similar insect as the squash borer. And it, you can, there's two types of worms in corn. One is the corn borer, which goes into the stalk, and there's an earworm. Two different insects. This is actually, the eggs for this are laid where a corn stalk and corn branch come together. And they're hard to control. And again, it's why I don't grow sweet corn, because there's a lot of, it's not the easiest to grow. But there are forms of Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a bacteria that you can get pelletized form, I think, and when we spread it in the corn, it'll actually fall in that kind of that cross between the stem and the leaf. Sure. Well, that's a good question. So the question is, where do they come from? Some of them probably overwinter here, and some of them come from the south. I think that there are, come from the south. They overwinter somewhere, but they'll move up as the year progresses. Depends upon how many life stages they have. Yeah, they come to look for our plants. Yeah. So if I did nothing about the corn borer, they may lay their eggs right there, and they're there for the next year. I don't know. Maybe they don't overwinter in this area. I don't know the specifics on these guys. Again, your corn earworm, Bacillus thuringiensis in a liquid form, or I have to call it BT. If you spray it into in kind of a stream into the tassel. No, it's not the tassel. It's the silk of the ear. Just as it starts to emerge, it'll control a lot of these. But a lot of farmers will sell it at the farmer's market. They say, we don't charge any extra for the worms. So, they can do a lot of damage at this size, but if you keep harvesting, you can kind of live with it. The cabbage worm comes from this butterfly. I guess I call it the cabbage butterfly. It's all over the place in the fall. Single dot on its wing. And this is what the caterpillar looks like when it gets big size. Causes quite a bit of damage. That's the cabbage worm damage on a head of cabbage, and by now that worm is probably inside that plant eating away where I can't find it. So this is an example where I didn't do anything about it until it was too late. So, and I'll talk about what to do about it. Another is the cabbage. I'm sorry, the carrot worm. I think it's got a couple of other names depending on what crop it's on. And it's a black swallowtail butterfly. So I don't like to kill it, but some years I get just such an infestation on my carrots that it just decimates the tops. And so I really have to do something about it. Sometimes I'll kill them. If I have Queen Anne's lace around, I will take it to the Queen Anne's lace and put it out there because it's another member of this family that they'll eat. But it's it's an individual decision as to me really. Aphids, I find that I don't have too much of a problem with them. This is an infestation of aphids on a tomato plant. And those little white things there are exoskeletons of plants that have been parasitized. So there's some kind of a parasite that's decimating but not getting rid of the aphid population. So yeah, I could spray this if I use this Safer soap. But Safer soap is it's an organically approved substance. You can buy it in almost any garden supply store. And basically what it does is it coats the aphid with a soap, and it can't breathe. So it suffocates it pretty well. I guess I thought I had pictures of some of those. Okay, so I may come to it later, but I'll skip ahead a little bit. Okay, there's 3 things I have in my arsenal as far as fighting insects. It's the Safer soap that I just mentioned. Primarily I use it on aphids, which I don't usually have a problem with. The other is BT or Bacillus thuringiensis. You can find it in the garden supply stores is Dipel or Thirdside. Bonite, is that a local company? It might be. It's a bacteria that only affects the Lepidoptera family of insects, which I know it's butterflies and maybe moths too. I think it is moths actually. So if you spray this, let's say cabbage, good example, or the cabbage family, you spray that on the leaves, you're not killing them by spraying it on. You're not killing the insect, but the insect, the cabbage worm, for instance, will digest that bacteria on the leaf. And it does something to its digestive system. So basically it kills it. Doesn't kill it immediately, so you won't see these cabbage worms dropping out of the plant, but it kills them in a couple of days. So in the fall, with my brassicas, you saw my fall brassicas, kale, broccoli, etc. I tend to spray this about every 10 days, because that's about the life cycle of those worms. And no matter what else I do to knock down the population, I know I'm going to have them. But because I don't want my insects to build up a resistance to it, I alternate with this particular product called Monterey Garden Insect Spray. Again, most seed catalogs sell it, but it's what's called a spinosad. It's another bacteria. Why I don't use it all the time, although I probably would use it on applications such as the squash bug, because it is it's more of a contact insecticide as opposed to one they have to ingest. But I don't want to use only the BT. I'm afraid my insect population is going to build up a resistance to it. So I like to go back and forth. The reason I don't use the contact all the time is because I have the possibility of killing some of my beneficial insects that might be in the garden, some of my parasites. So every 10 days in the fall, I give them a spray of one of those. The only other times I'll use this, again, is when I see a large population of squash bugs. I might spray that one particular leaf that has those squash bugs on it, and I can knock the population back or eliminate the population that way. Any questions on the insect? I mean, there's probably hundreds of other insects we could cover. I'm trying to cover some of the main ones that I see, and hopefully the main ones you see. Okay, so let's go on to more common insects. We may be running over time-wise, but I'll try to go through this real quickly. Most common one is late blight of tomatoes. Late blight and early blight, I get the names mixed up, but this, even though it's called late blight, it generally comes on early in the season. It could be, there are other things like anthracnose that this possibly could be, but usually it's one of those things that splashes up from the soil. It's in the soil. I don't know if you can ever get rid of it. But sometimes if I see it starting, I'll cut off these leaves because I got plenty of new growth at the top that'll take its place. And sometimes, after a while, it starts killing the plant up, but it's always from the bottom up. So in the late fall, my plant is all brown at the bottom, but as long as it's green at the top, it's still producing tomatoes. I'm okay. This is, I believe it's early blight, completely different crop. I mean, completely different problem. And it's this waterlogged look to the leaf. And same on the tomato plant. The tomato fruit, it's this waterlogged look. And tomatoes, this family, tomatoes, potatoes, peppers or whatnot, is mainly what it goes after. And it's something that every 10 years or so, we have an infestation of that. The conditions are just right, and it works its way up the Atlantic seaboard. So we kind of know when it's coming. Once it's affected your plant, there's not really a lot you can do about it. It's a poor year for tomatoes. And sometimes you might be able to throw this stuff out and save some of the plants, save it from spreading. But that's hard to do. Now, one nice thing is this does not overwinter in this area. The spores or whatever, the overwintering thing, it doesn't overwinter in this area. So you could actually compost this. I probably would take it to the woods, but you probably won't have a problem the next year. Where you might get into problems is if you grow tomatoes, because they can infest your tomatoes, potatoes too. And when you harvest potatoes, there's always the little ones you miss, and they start sending up those shoots in that last year's potato bed. those can harbor the crop. So if you see any of those volunteer potatoes coming out of last year's potato crop, after a year after you've had this, then just take them, throw them in the trash. Harvest really well, but throw them in the trash. Otherwise, you can be infesting your area. They will not overwinter except on live plant material. And so if you leave that live plant material in, get rid of it. Okay, another really common one is powdery mildew on summer squashes somewhat, but more on winter squashes. I am from New England and I used to grow a lot of winter squashes, didn't have this problem. I'm finding the farther south you go, the worse powdery mildew is. But I find that if I'm choosing a winter squash, I only grow butternuts. Butternuts seem to be the most resistant to this. They will get this. This is from a butternut squash leaf, but they seem to hold off later in the season, and it doesn't kill the leaf as much as it might on some of the other ones, your acorns, your Hubbards. I don't know specifically. I don't remember. It's a long time since I've grown any acorns. I know I had more serious problems. I don't think there's anything you can do to actually stop it. There are sprays you can use to hold it back, but you can't kill it. You can just stop its prevention. The sprays that are organically approved are copper-based, as copper sulfate. I've never really done that. I just kind of let nature take its course. Usually my summer squash it's not affected bad enough to stop producing. And the winter squash I use is butternut, and that doesn't seem to be as bad for that. Yeah, there's a lot of different diseases of cabbage. They come in late in the season. I told you I grow for fall harvest, so some of them can be. I think there's a black rot starting in here. So one of the problems that is it may not last as long in storage. Now, this another new disease that I've only come into in the past few years is called Cercospora on the beet family, which includes spinach and Swiss chard. You've probably seen some of this if you've grown beets. And this is something, it's a disease that's overwintered in the soil. And if you rotate your crops and don't come back to the same place with beets for 3 years in a row, you can get rid of most of it. I'm told, I haven't tried this out, but some of the more elongated beets, I don't remember the name. Cilantro is one I think are less susceptible, but they're still susceptible. And this is something that's been infected. You can see why it gets the name Cercospora. There's some kind of a spore landed there. It's growing out. And it's going to destroy the whole leaf. If you remember that, that beet crop I showed you earlier, this is the same planting. And those earlier, I thinned out the beets. I took out the biggest ones, and the ones that remained there, they got hit by the Cercospora, and they didn't grow anymore. Basically, the leaves all died. So and it doesn't hurt the beets. I can still harvest the beets, but I planted beets early and late in my rotation, so I planted like too many areas, beets, spinach, or whatever. So I'm doing without that whole family for 3 years, and so this year and next year's the last year. I'm not gonna plant beets again until a year after next, and I'm hoping that I can really knock this disease back. But again, the plants will get some pretty good growth. They don't hit it right when they're young. So you can often get a pretty good harvest. That's good sized beets. And you saw the beets I pulled out of there before. So, okay, weeds. There's a number of types. These are annuals. That's red root pigweed, lamb's quarters. There's several of my arsenal, I guess you could say. And the two on the left are my main weed control. The one on the left is called a swan neck hoe. It's really the only one I own. I don't own that one in the middle. That's called a stirrup shuffle hoe. But the idea between the two on the left is that they are made so that they just skim the surface of the soil. They don't dig into the soil. The one on the right is a regular garden hoe. I use it for chopping cover crops. I don't really use it for weeds, because what I would like to do is skim the surface of the soil when the weeds are this size. Now, this is, I think that's actually a scallion, an example of a scallion crop that's already had one harvest. But the top of that photo I've already skimmed that with one of my shuffle hose. And you can see it's uprooted most of those weeds. You don't see the weeds in there anymore. The idea is you're exposing them. You're either cutting through them or you're exposing the root to the air when they're really young and they'll die quickly. Even if I don't see them emerging like I do on the bottom, I would still go through there and try to prevent them from getting to this stage. Because sometimes when they're at this stage, they're far enough along that sometimes you don't completely uproot them, so they will root back in the soil. But it sure beats going in there by hand and waiting until each of those weeds get to a foot high and picking them by hand. So basically, it's prevention. For those of you here, I have my. Actually, I guess I've got some pictures of it coming. So I'll wait till some of your other annual weeds, purslane. Sometimes you can hoe this ground, but it's really succulent, and you get a rain. Those roots seem to be able to find a way to the moisture. So sometimes it roots itself. So sometimes you really might have to use some hand weeding. Galansoga, really common one around here. It seeds up in about 30 days. So you got to keep after this when it's young, get it out young. Wood sorrel, wood sorrel. Looks like clover, except it's got the heart-shaped leaf, but it's another annual, but it seems to also come up, it seems to have the ability to come up from its roots. So if you get this guy when it's young, it's a lot better control than trying to pull it out, because leaving a little bit of larger plants roots in there will cause it to sprout. Some of your, particularly your fall grasses, they come in tufts, they're hard to get rid of. So you want them to prevent them from getting to this stage where, I think this is probably foxtail, that you've got seeds that are going to repopulate. Probably crabgrass, again, it's at the stage where it's too far along. But this can be pulled out. And once you pull it out, you're pulling out a lot of soil too. So if they were to get to this stage in my pathway, for instance, I would just kind of leave it upside down. If it still has that root clod on it, that'll dry out, hopefully die back. A few other fairly common ones, wood sorrel. Tend to find it if you have flower gardens, perennial plant gardens. It dies back quickly if you cultivate, if you keep cultivating soil, but in places where it's not cultivated, it has this little shallow root that'll send out all of. If it gets in my garden, I do hand pick it, but I wait till right after a rain. The soil is nice and soft, and then I pull it out, and I can usually pull out about a foot of root with it too. This is what it looks like when it gets to be older. It's but again, you don't want it to get to this stage, because that's going to seed in. Now there are a couple of more or less roots that I have to worry about. One is dandelion. The other is wild onion. So the wild onion, it doesn't cause too much of a problem, but I find in April, if I use one of these, I think they call them dandelion pullers actually, to just uproot that wild onion, that I get it out. And if I leave it, what's going to happen is this bulb that you see is going to start dividing into bulblets, so that next year I don't have one big seed, but I have all these little ones that will eventually grow to those big bulbs. So I kind of like to spend a little bit of hand time pulling these guys out. You can't get them all, but it just diligence like that will really lessen the problem. The other is thistle. Thistle generally, it gets to this size, it's got a pretty good root system. You may not be able to kill it right away using that dandelion puller. If I get about 5 or 6 inches underneath the soil, it'll take most of the reserves out of that root. It'll put up another top, but if I keep knocking that back, it'll eventually use up the reserves in the soil and pretty much kill it. That's what thistle looks like when it gets to be older. Its flowers. Probably one of the last ones is called nutsedge. Again, it likes compacted soils. So you may have it because you have compacted soils, but this is what it looks like. That's what it looks like when it's seeding. This is what it looks like if you pull it out of the ground a little earlier. It has a little nut on the bottom of it. And that nut will divide into 7 new plants for next year. So I like to pull these out. They don't tend to to be real heavy in my area. So I spend a little time, if I see them come up in the springtime, I get them before they have caused that division. Okay, a little bit about critters. You know, I won't get deeply into fencing, but you know, if you have a fence to keep them out, whether it be a yard fence or a garden fence, you'll get damage such as groundhogs coming in, you know, the tops of your carrots, your leaves. You know, Havahart traps work real well. I won't talk about what I do with my groundhogs when I keep them. This happens to be raccoon. I don't really have an issue with raccoons, so I will just let the raccoons go. The one problem I could run into with a raccoon is in melons. They seem to know exactly when the melons are ripe. Because that's the way I tell people to know when their melons are ripe is wait till the raccoons have eaten them, and then you know that they were ripe the day before. So yeah, so again, I don't have a problem with these guys now because I actually just, let me back up a little bit. I used to have sheep. And to keep the predators away from the sheep, I had electric fence, and I had this little strobe light I put on the fence, and it kept all the predators away from the sheep. And I actually raised chickens that way too. And it's just that blinking of the light, you know, predators don't know what to make of it. So this is now available online. It's called Night Guard. I'm sorry. And it's a blinking strobe light. It's dark in here. It's dark enough in here right now that it's blinking. If I was down where there's a little more light and I put my hand over the top, you know, and it wasn't on, you'd see that it would start blinking. It blinks at night. It's a solar collector at the top, so it picks up its energy, and then at night it blinks all night long. Now you probably need at least two. The solar guard, a Night Guard company will tell you need 4, one facing each direction. But with my, you know, small 40 by 40 foot garden, I have 2 of them. I have, you know, facing in opposite directions. And in 3 or 4 years that I've been using this, and it's still the same one, so it's, you know, it's got a good life to it. I've not lost a melon. So I only plant like 2 or 3 melon, three melon crop plants a year, 4 maybe, and I get about you know, 8 to 12 melons a year. I've not lost one since I started planting this. I used to have to do that, you know, you wait till you lose the first 1 or 2 to the raccoons. And okay, then I would harvest them early. They weren't quite ripe. So it's not only giving me the advantage of it saved all my crop, but it has allowed me to pick them when they're at a more, you know, a better stage in their life. Other things I will, if I have a problem with chipmunks, you know, you might be able to catch them in a Havahart trap. Rat traps will work also. And I generally only have a problem with those every once in a while in my strawberries. They seem to like strawberries, they'll take them to their nest. I won't get into the ethics of that. One of the things that you may have another problem with is not mice, but voles. Voles, you'll know you have them. They might be underneath the mulch. So sometimes I find them in my potatoes. They like root crops. I pull back that mulch. I find these pathways in there, and then I find a lot of the tops of the potatoes. I'll find them in other things. They like the beets. They love the beets and that chard spinach. They like spinach roots. But you'll often find a pathway. They're eating through the sod or eating through the weeds, just making a pathway in the soil. So if you can find that pathway, if you find a pathway, you know you've got voles, not moles. Moles go underground. It's a different thing. And you can't get them with bait. But if you take a little mouse trap like this, drill a hole and put a larger nail as you can find in it, and put them in that pathway. And I put a couple of pieces of wood on the side just to make sure they're not going around it. So the voles will come along, and whichever one that side it comes from, it'll step on one of those and it'll get immediately snapped. If you in fact find a little hole that they make into the ground, they're ground burrows, and they may be coming in from the woods nearby, or they may be making a nest right into your garden. If you find that hole, you can put one of those snap traps in there, such that the thing that sets the snap up is facing into the hole, just a little bit in the hole, and the holes don't go straight up; they go at an angle, so it's pretty easy to set it. And the first vole to come out of there will get snapped. Now, when I first started learning how to control these, I had a really bad problem. And I caught 17 voles that first year. And I think I got rid of most of them. I think that was a year that I used to use netting to kind of protect my berries. And I think early on, I think that was a year early on, I caught a black snake got tangled in there and it died. And, you know, a month later I had a vole problem. So that black snake was there before a lot of those voles had probably been born. And, you know, it was providing at least some measure of control. So, you know, black snakes are another, probably any kind of snake. I think I saw a milk snake there one year. Probably does the same thing. So, you know, a really effective control. So I think that's all I have. And I probably ran over. Sorry. Oh, Jesus. And I know somebody had to leave early, but any questions before we wrap up? You can come up here and ask me more questions. There's plenty more catalog. I encourage you to take some of the information on NOFA. Yeah, yeah. And maybe the one thing I didn't have a photo of is the slugs. Again, go out at night with a light. You can pick them off the plants. And there is a organically approved product called Sluggo. It's ferret, it's some kind of iron pellet.